Plunged into a working deficit resulting from years of underfunding and bad management, the British Railways of the 1950s was trying to find ways to recover and make the railways pay their way once again. The flagship project of the British Railways Modernisation Plan, announced in 1955, was the electrification of the West Coast Main Line. In the 1950s, this was still a steam main line, with a vast variety of locomotives on trains from London to the cities and towns of the Midlands, North Wales, the northwest of England and Scotland. Historically, it was the most important main line in Great Britain, and its modernisation was a priority for the nationalised British Railways. Steam was seen as old-fashioned and dirty. Electricity was modern and clean. BR was keen to spread the message.
If you thought that effect was electrifying, here's something that really is. The overhead wires that are gradually bringing electrification to the whole of our railway system, except the southern region, which will retain the familiar third rail. Power is the key word in a modern railway network, and there are 25,000 volts in those wires. To the layman, surely nothing could be more confusing or complex than a place like this. Not a signal box, but the electrical control room at Canterbury, which covers over 90 route miles and operates switches at current feeder points by remote control throughout an area extending from Gillingham to Ramsgate and Dover. It's scarcely an unskilled job being a railwayman these days. Needless to say, one of the greatest problems is to build new stations and keep the present ones operating. A solution to this engineer's nightmare would be to shut down stations like Euston for a couple of years, but that's not exactly practical. Some of the new designs are extremely attractive. This, for example, is Oxford Road, Manchester. However, before projects like these can be started, scale models have to be made of each proposed new station and considered by an endless number of bodies such as ministries, municipal councils, police, chambers of commerce, and remote concerns we've probably never even heard of. This, by the way, is a glimpse of Leeds City Station as it will eventually look. We grumble sometimes at higher fares, and why not? But it's good to know that by these means, our railways will not only make up lost ground, but be able to continue their old tradition of pioneering and set new standards for the world to follow.
By the beginning of 1960, there was a great deal of progress to be seen on the West Coast electrification project, and some of the locomotives and multiple unit stock had been delivered. The first new locomotive of all was number E3001, a 3,200 horsepower AC electric machine built by the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company to a British Thomson Houston design. It was handed over to British Railways on the 30th of November 1959 at Sandbach Station, a milestone event in the history of the nationalised concern. Trial running was undertaken on part of the line from Crewe to Manchester, known as the Style Line, which was to be the first part of the great undertaking to be energised. Services would commence on the 12th of September 1960. Some observers questioned the wisdom of commencing with the Style Line, but it was in effect self-contained. Trains would be hauled from Euston by diesel to Crewe, from whence they would be electrically hauled to Manchester, to the renamed Manchester London Road Station, which would henceforth be known as Manchester Piccadilly. A new cast crest was applied to the new electric locomotives, for which a new blue livery had been devised. This was known as electric blue, and was clean and modern when compared to the standard Brunswick green which had been applied to steam express locomotives and to diesels. This emphasised the modern look of what was already being referred to as the new railway. At this time the coaches used were all of the British Railways standard Mark I type, which bore the standard maroon livery. This looked very smart when coupled to the new electric locomotives. Electrification of the West Coast Main Line, which title included the branch main lines to Manchester and Liverpool, had commenced in 1956 with work to raise a number of bridges to accommodate the wires, or catenary, for the overhead electricity supply. The initial stretch from Manchester to Crewe was followed by the line to Liverpool in January 1962. Crewe to Stafford followed in December that year, after which the wires gradually extended up the West Coast Main Line via the Trent Valley, finally reaching Euston in April 1966. That just left the Birmingham line to be finished a year later. Throughout the period of the project, many trains were diverted to enable the engineers to have full possession of the line to be able to do their works. Major engineering work included the complete opening out of 2 tunnels at Stockport. It was simpler to do this than to try and increase the bore of the tunnel, especially as normal service trains had to be accommodated on the lines wherever possible. On a project of this magnitude, it was impracticable to try to work only at weekends or overnight. In order to provide enough experience with the locomotive types for use on the finished system, British Railways ordered a series of small batches from a number of manufacturers. There was no history of 25,000 volt AC traction in the United Kingdom at this time, so these were pioneering locomotive types. 100 locomotives were ordered, of 5 main varieties. E3001 started a complete new numbering series for British Railways, E for electrics. It was the first of a series of 25 locomotives. 2 specifications had been issued for Type A and Type B electric locomotives, which had no relationship to the Type A, B and C diesel locomotive types. Type A was for a passenger locomotive, whilst Type B was for freight work, with a slightly reduced maximum speed. 2 of the Pioneer locomotives were built to the Type B specification, but the other 23 were Type A. These were geared for a top speed of 100 miles an hour, the first such on British Railways. These locomotives were classed as AL1s, standing for AC Electric Locomotive Class 1. This, designed by British Thomson Houston, later became Class 81. 22 locomotives from 4 classes were delivered before services commenced in September 1960. The others were the first members of classes built by Metropolitan Vickers. A total of 10 Class AL2 were ordered, 15 Class AL3s from English Electric and 10 AL4s of GEC design built by the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow. The 5th class, which made up the total of 100, consisted of 40 Class AL5s to be built by British Railways themselves at Doncaster Works, although none were ready for the opening, deliveries commencing in 1961. In addition to the locomotives, 15 electric multiple units of Class AM4 were supplied in time for the opening. These were built at BR's Wolverton Works and were of the outer suburban type, having doors to all compartments. They were turned out in the standard multiple unit green livery and were similar in appearance to other units for third rail and overhead use. A further 30 of this type would be delivered in 1961 and 1962 when the Liverpool and Stafford wires were energised. Perhaps the last word on electrification should go to the irrepressible newsreel commentator.
While in service, checkups have to be carried out on such aspects as the electrified overhead wires with the aid of this remarkable gondola car. From this mobile laboratory, with its pantograph and other test equipment, engineers can inspect variation in height, wear and endurance under high-speed conditions. New equipment, new ideas, and most important of all, a new spirit of determination to ensure that our railways will soon once again beat the world.
During the period in which the West Coast Main Line was being electrified, British Railways encouraged passengers to take alternative routes to Manchester and Birmingham, as many trains to those destinations via the West Coast were suspended or cancelled. The old Midland Railway had built a main line through Derby and the Peak District to Manchester, and additional trains were put on which would reach the northern city in a better time than from Euston. One new service which started in summer 1960 was a daily Pullman train to London St Pancras from Manchester Central, leaving at 08:50 and arriving at 12:03. The return run left London at 6:10 that evening and arrived at 9:20 p.m. These were the fastest ever times on the Midland route and featured this brand new diesel Pullman design, popularly known as the Blue Pullman. The new units had been proposed as early as 1957, when it was announced that BR was to introduce a new all first-class Pullman train to counter the air service of BEA. It would have a target schedule of 3 hours, and the units would be ready in 1958. the same time, the Western region would start 2 Pullman services to Bristol and Birmingham with similar trains. This announcement was made at about the same time as the West Coast Main Line electrification started, so passengers would have time to adjust to the new routes. The introduction of the new trains was delayed for a variety of reasons, initially because they were a radical departure from anything that had gone before. They would be the first high-speed diesel multiple units and would have power cars at each end. They were built by Metropolitan Camel to a BR design. 2 6-car sets were built for the Midland Pullman service and 3 8-car sets for the Western region ones. The first was completed in October 1959, almost 2 years late. There then followed an extensive testing programme on the Midland Main Line, which revealed serious problems with their riding characteristics and involved modifications to the bogies. However, the rough riding was never fully cured. The Midland Pullman eventually entered public service on the 4th of July 1960, with a fill-in turn from St Pancras to Leicester at midday. The timings were amended from the 2nd of January 1961, so as to arrive in London at 11 o'clock to give businessmen more time in London, and the Leicester turn was dropped due to staff roster problems and poor loadings. The Western services started on the 12th of September 1960, and both from Bristol, Temple Meads and Wolverhampton gave businessmen a much better arrival time in London at 9:35. The Western trains had both first and second class accommodation. The usual publicity attended the launch, and of course didn't mention the rough ride.
Now, in case you've never met one, let me introduce the new diesel-electric Pullman train. Evidence of British Railways' progress in their streamlining and modernisation programme. It's a luxury express with improved comfort. Smooth, almost silent travel, I'm told, and fully air-conditioned coaches. Double windows with adjustable Venetian blinds between the panes of glass. The armchair seats are adjustable too, and I've no doubt that those who sit in them will find that menus have also been modernised. It would be disappointing to find the old brown Windsor aboard a train like this.
The Blue Pullman story was comparatively short. Once the West Coast Main Line electrification was completed in 1967, the 2 Midland units were transferred to the Western region for a new service to Oxford. An additional service ran to South Wales to supplement the South Wales Pullman, which it commenced running to Swansea in the summer of 1961. Their lives were short, all being out of use by 1975, so they were one of the many extravagances of the British Railways modernisation plan. On the other side of the coin, the most successful part of the plan was electrification, and blue was the colour, but it wasn't all plain sailing. Flying over Glasgow, we can see one of the most extensive suburban systems in the United Kingdom. This was a priority for electrification. It had been built up by 3 major Scottish railway companies, the Caledonian, the Glasgow and South Western, and the North British. All were efficiently worked by steam, but as much of the system, especially the North British lines to the north of the River Clyde, was in tunnels, it could be an unpleasant place to be. The modernisation plan envisaged 2 phases of electrification, to the north and south of the city, and the first trains started running on the lines to the north of the city as Phase 1 on the 5th of November 1960, a date of great significance to the English, if not the Scots, which would prove to be quite prophetic for the blue trains. The train sets produced for this scheme were the most advanced electric multiple units yet, and were finished in a striking blue livery, which led to the nickname of the Glasgow Blue Trains. Officially, this colour was described as Caledonian blue, as it was similar to the colour which had been used on that company's steam locomotives. Special attention was given to their appearance, and the design of the cabins gave them a very stylish and modern look. Electrification of the underground and tunnel sections of the line were fraught with difficulties, as clearance had to be found for the overhead catenary. Enlargement was both too expensive and too difficult, particularly as the existing steam service had to continue to run whilst electrification took place. The solution was to lower the track bed during weekend possessions when commuter traffic was light. Phase 1 was to wire the lines from Airdrie in the east to Helensburgh in the west, via Glasgow Queen Street low-level station. In addition, branches to Balloch Pier, Mulgai and Springburn were included. The overhead was energised at the new national standard using AC current at 25,000 volts, 25 kilovolts or kV, except in the tunnel sections where the lower voltage of 6.25 kV was used. This was because it was thought that the limited clearances in tunnels might cause troubles with the full 25 kV, although advances in electric technology would soon overcome this. Unfortunately, although the first units had been satisfactorily tested on the Style line in England, a disastrous series of transformer explosions meant that the new trains had to be temporarily withdrawn until the problems could be solved. The worst was an explosion on a train near Renton on the 13th of December, in which 7 passengers and the guard were hurt. Another explosion on the 17th of December resulted in the suspension of all services. Steam returned 2 days later. This wasn't a simple matter, as the steam locomotives in stock had already begun to be dispersed and the steam sheds closed. This temporary service was to last for 11 months, and the electric service had to be relaunched, nearly a year after its initial introduction in October 1961. The problems with the units had also been experienced on the new units of the Tilbury line, which shared the Blue Train's electrical specification. It was traced to overheating of transformer cooling oil, which vaporised and became explosive. 2 Ministry of Transport investigations concluded that all the powered coaches, 77 had been delivered out of a total of 91 ordered, would need major alterations, and they were sent to Metropolitan Vickers in Manchester for these to be done. Further trials ensued on the Style line before the go-ahead to relaunch the trains was given. The remaining units on order were delivered during 1961 in time for the launch of the second phase of the Glasgow electrification. This involved the lines to the south of the river, which were the Glasgow and south-western ones to Paisley in the west, and the Caledonian ones to Motherwell and the south-east of the city, notably the Cathcart Circle. The troubles with the units led to the opening south of the river being delayed until May 1962. Servicing depots were established at Hindland and South Shields. The 2 systems remained separate until 1976, when a connection via the Glasgow Central low-level line was created. The 2 were referred to as the North and South Clyde lines, the latter working out of Glasgow Central high-level station. The Cathcart Circle part of the South Clyde system was an out-and-back service to Central. A further extension to the system was approved and opened to Weems Bay and Gourock in 1967, for which a further 19 units were supplied. The original units had been built in Scotland by Press Steel at Linwood near Paisley. These later units came from Cravens in Sheffield. The Scottish ones were initially classified as AM3 units before the introduction of tops, and the Cravens ones AM10. Together they were the main trains on the Glasgow Suburban Railway network for over 25 years before being progressively phased out by newer rolling stock. Based on the Mark I body shell design, the units had many features which made them state-of-the-art at the time of their introduction. These included the wrap-around front cab windows and the glass partitions in the carriages, which allowed passengers in the front and rear carriages to see the driver's view of the track. This was particularly appreciated in the scenic riverside areas around Craigendoran and Helensburgh, and then much missed after refurbishment, when they were replaced by blank panels. The use of pneumatically operated sliding passenger doors with passenger-operated door opening buttons dramatically improved the flow of commuters. In practice, the doors were usually operated by the guard, or later, after modification for driver-only operation, the driver. It can safely be said that the Glasgow Blue trains were one of the undoubted successes of the modernisation plan. Electrification was once again shown to be the way forward for the railways. Elsewhere, change was afoot. British Railways still knew that the British public was fascinated by steam, and exhibitions still featured the famous Speed King Mallard, and also the very last steam locomotive built for BR, Evening Star. It was somewhat inappropriate that she was built at Swindon, the famous Great Western Railway workshops. As we've seen earlier in our story, the Western region had followed the traditions of its pre-nationalisation predecessor and gone about modernisation in its own way. Initially, this took the form of ordering 2 gas turbine locomotives when other companies were testing diesels, and later using hydraulic drive when others used electric. The Western had also been reluctant to use many of the standard steam locomotives and had received very few of them, persuading British Railways to allow them to continue to build to pre-nationalisation designs to a far greater extent than the other regions. The final steam locomotives of all were the Class 9F 210Os, of which Evening Star was the very last, and the Western had campaigned hard to avoid having any of these at all, failing for once in their argument to build more of the 1903 designed 2800 280s. The final GWR design locomotives were these Class 9400 pannier tanks, the last examples of which were delivered in 1956, after the announcement of the modernisation plan. There was logic to the Western region's attempted rejection of the standard locomotive types, as their locomotive stock had been built to their own standardisation scheme since 1903, and all their works and locomotive sheds had stocks of parts which could be used on their own locomotive types. Introduction of BR standards would actually have exactly the opposite effect to that intended, as they were non-standard to the Western. Many observers had thought the Great Western to be somewhat hidebound in its locomotive development after the original standardisation policy was introduced by the great locomotive engineer George Jackson Churchward. He had been succeeded by Charles Collett just before the grouping of 1923, and he had been succeeded by Frederick Hawkesworth in 1941. The latter had designed the 9400 pannier tanks as an update of the earlier 5700s produced by Collett. What many failed to realise was that the Great Western management set great store by continuity, and the classic copper-cap chimneys and brass safety valve covers set atop the apparently unchanged outlines of kings, halls and castles concealed many advanced features which would have been revealed by total changes in outline on any other railway. Hawkesworth's modifications to GWR designs were most dramatically seen in his modified halls and the subsequent counties. As a result, there was little change to be seen on the Western during the 1950s, pending dieselisation. But dieselisation did result in many changes. The modernisation plan for the Western was different to that of any of the other regions. We've seen that there was to have been some degree of assessment of diesel locomotive types under the 1955 plan, but that events, as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan so memorably said, had derailed the plan within 18 months, so severely that mass ordering of untried locomotive types had been put in place before the pilot scheme types had been delivered, let alone assessed. The only part of the plan regarding dieselisation which continued satisfactorily was the diesel railcar programme, which was merely an extension of a pre-modernisation plan programme in any event. This affected the Western region in much the same way as the other regions, as large numbers of diesel multiple units took over from steam on suburban and rural routes. But the plan's pilot scheme had allowed the Western to investigate a different form of diesel locomotive type for mainline traction. It would have been a small trial, as just 11 diesel hydraulics were authorised under the pilot scheme. Swindon persuaded the British Transport Commission to increase this by a further 3 locomotives, and these were the first of what was to become the famous warship class. There were no plans for electrification of any of the Western region's main lines in the modernisation plan. Where dieselisation was a short-term solution pending electrification for all other regions, on the Western, modernisation was dieselisation for the long term, and it was to be allowed to develop an independent programme. The BTC's sudden change in emphasis from gradual to immediate dieselisation meant that it ordered much larger numbers of locomotives than originally envisaged under the pilot scheme plan. Most were extension orders of the pilot scheme types, some being expanded from just 10 to hundreds of a single type. On the Western, this meant that the order for 3 warships placed in 1956 suddenly became an order for 33 locomotives in February 1957, some 16 months before the prototype, numbered D800, was even completed. These were all to be built at Swindon. The collapse of the pilot scheme meant that all locomotive builders in Great Britain received extensive orders and that all available capacity was required. The first pilot scheme diesel hydraulics had been the 5 D600s produced by the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow, and they in turn were given an order for another 33 locomotives in January 1958, but this time to the Swindon design. In 1959, Swindon was given an order for a final 5 locomotives, taking the class total to 71. The Swindon hydraulics were designed to produce a locomotive with a high power output and a low weight. One of the reasons that the diesel electrics for the other regions were of very heavy construction was that they were intended to replace steam locomotives virtually on a like-for-like basis. This meant that they had to be able to control freight trains without continuous braking, a feature which British Railways had inherited. The contemporary 2,000 horsepower English electric diesels used on other regions had 2 8-wheel bogies and weighed 135 tons to give them adequate braking. The warships, also with 2,000 horsepower, weighed 79 tons and had half as many wheels. They were primarily intended for use on passenger trains, although the most prestigious, curiously, were to be entrusted to the diesel-electric Blue Pullmans, a design produced in addition to the general Western Region remit under the auspices of the British Transport Commission. 2 services were to be operated, to Bristol and South Wales and to Birmingham, the latter being the more significant because of the electrification of the West Coast Main Line. Just as Manchester passengers were encouraged to use the Midland route with its Pullmans, so Birmingham passengers were given Pullmans on the Western route. Also to this end, the modernisation of the Western's locomotive fleet was given a further boost, and 4 months after the last order for warships, Swindon was instructed to build further diesel hydraulics as part of this programme. Rather than build more warships, a new, more powerful design, appropriately known as Westerns, was produced. These ran on 2 6-wheel bogies and boasted 2,700 horsepower. Just one order for 74 locomotives was placed in September 1959, with 35 to be built at Swindon and 39 at Crewe. The Westerns were somewhat heavier than the warships, and a number of design problems were encountered. The first, D1000 Western Enterprise, was only released to traffic in December 1961, and delivery of the remainder was long drawn out, the final crew machines not appearing until 1964. They shared a problem with their riding characteristics with the warships, which would take some time to correct. British Railways had inherited a fleet of coaches fitted with steam heating, a byproduct of the steam locomotive. The Mark I coaches were also fitted with this, and so all diesel passenger locomotives had to be fitted with steam generating boilers to heat carriages. As dieselisation progressed, British Railways decided to fit electric heating to new coaches and to retrofit earlier ones. The hydraulics had no space to fit additional equipment, and unlike diesel electrics which have an electric generator, no electrical system off which to tap power to provide electric heating. Another part of the modernisation plan was to equip all goods vehicles with continuous brakes. Although this would take some time to achieve, the design of the Western Region hydraulics was made on the assumption this would happen, and thus they could be much lighter, as they wouldn't have to have an excess braking force, as with the diesel electrics. Unfortunately, this was another aspect of the plan which wasn't to be realised quickly, and so the hydraulics remained principally passenger locomotives throughout their lives. The Westerns always looked the part. They were very carefully styled by British Railways design panel, and it's generally acknowledged that they were the most successful result of that team's work. Sadly, in their work, they didn't live up to their looks. Another very stylish locomotive appeared in May 1961 after a 9-year gestation. This was GT3, the third gas turbine prototype to run on British Railways. Like the 2 which the Western Region had ordered before their diesel hydraulic classes, GT3 was a developmental blind alley. It owed its strange appearance to its early design, as it was constructed on an adapted British Railways standard steam locomotive chassis and tender. It had been started in 1952 when gas turbines appeared to be a viable option for rail, but it was put on the back burner as the first two had shown alarmingly high fuel consumption. English Electric eventually completed it and tried it out on BR, but it was too late as the BTC had decided to standardise on diesels. It was withdrawn after just 19 months of trials. Although we've chronicled many failings and many problems resulting from the modernisation plan, the overall concept was sound. By the early 1960s, British Railways was enjoying the first fruits of modernisation. For many passengers, the diesel multiple unit was the normal train to ride on for both suburban and rural journeys. The massively expanded programme to acquire them had not thrown up too many unsuccessful or non-standard types. The only ones to go early were the pre-modernisation plan units, as they weren't standard with the later ones, and many of the services they were built for were withdrawn. Similarly, the electrification schemes of the modernisation plan were an unqualified success, including the changeover from 1500 volts DC to 25 kilovolts AC traction on the Great Eastern lines. Pre-nationalisation rolling stock saw out its full service life and was replaced successfully in due course. The one omission in the pilot scheme diesel fleet was for a medium power machine, but this was corrected when the original types A to C were expanded to types 1 to 5. The English Electric Type 3 appeared in 1960 and became the standard mid-power type. The early heavy diesel electric Type 4s, such as this British Railways built Peak, were coming into general service and speeding up trains on main lines such as the Midland Main Line. By the early 1960s, the majority of express passenger trains had been equipped with the Mark I passenger carriages, and there was a distinct change in the appearance of the traditional freight train. Modern long wheelbase or bogie freight stock was being introduced with continuous braking, such as this cement train behind an English Electric Type 4, making the 8-wheel bogies of these Type 4s redundant and opening the way to develop lighter weight locomotives of this type. The smaller Type 2 diesels were produced in a number of varieties, but British Railway's own version was destined to become the standard type with 477 built. These were a successful development of pilot scheme machines, but some of the other Type 2s were some of the least successful diesels ever, especially the Metropolitan Vickers Cobos, which fortunately were not multiplied when the mass orders were placed. The Condor, which the Cobos initially worked, was intended to be the first of a series of high-profile general freight trains introduced with the new diesel traction. The object was to update British Railway's goods-carrying image with a fast, regularly timetabled freight service running at or near passenger speeds. It was introduced in 1959 and was the most visible sign of the change in freight traffic handling which was taking place. It derived its name from its use of container wagons, with the objective of providing an overnight door-to-door service. The containers which made up the train were effectively to replace the traditional covered vans seen here, which had heretofore been the standard for non-mineral traffic. Another attempt to alleviate the problems inherent in the transshipment of freight from road to rail was the road railer, for which a pair of prototype wagons appeared in 1961. They were based on an American concept and appeared to be a very effective solution to transshipment, particularly as they needed no special facilities other than hard standing alongside a siding.
But getting back to trains, and in this case freight transport, here's a novel idea which cuts out the bother of getting the freight onto the train in the first place. The 11-ton road railer has an ingenious rear undercarriage that turns it in 90 seconds from a lorry to a wagon, with flanged steel rims replacing rubber tires. Consequently, as a means of freight delivery, it has the flexibility of a lorry that can drive from door to door, avoiding the usual problems of traffic congestion.
For a while, the road railer concept seemed to be very promising. However, another American concept had already overtaken it. Users of these vehicles realised that there was no return in carrying two sets of road gear under each van and aboard ships, so they simply removed them and created the modern container, which would soon be taken forward by British Railways itself. A train of these vehicles was put into service but only lasted for a short while. Elsewhere, there were other new railways in Britain.
Say railway, think of Beeching. But what do names like the Countess, Ken Nelson, Bob Harris and Laurie Brooks signify? Well, they're all involved in a railway at Welshpool, a railway which is actually reopening. The rebirth of this narrow gauge line in mid-Wales brings a gleam of optimism into the ominous picture outlined by the Beeching plan. Thanks to the local light railway preservation company, a new passenger service will be operating at weekends. If the Beeching axe falls, this will be the only steam service left in an area sadly short of trains. Originally opened in 1903, it's the first passenger service on the line for over 30 years. Though the grass has grown between the sleepers, thanks to the enterprise of a group of enthusiasts, a sleeping railway has awakened.
Beeching was the name on every railwayman's lips in 1963. We'll be examining the effects of his notorious plan later in this series, but for now we'll take a last look at the pre-Beeching railway, symbolised by these scenes on the eastern region, where one of, and soon to be the, most famous locomotives of all time was due to be withdrawn from active service. Following 40 years of service, during which the locomotive racked up nearly 2 million miles, she was to be sold out of service on the 15th of January 1963 to Alan Pegler, a businessman from Doncaster, the town in which the locomotive was built. Here we see the proud new owner with British Railways locomotive number 60103 and still in its final working condition. This was Flying Scotsman, the first locomotive built for the London and North Eastern Railway as far back as 1923. The locomotive was symbolic of the last years of steam under British Railways, as, although already over 35 years old, it, together with many other members of its class of 78 locomotives, had been updated with improved exhaust arrangements and a double chimney. This had given rise to a soft exhaust, which could impair the driver's vision, so a pair of smoke deflectors had been fitted, which, resembling those in use in Germany, became known as German deflectors. Traditionalists hated them, but others felt they made the locomotives look very up to date. This was the first express passenger locomotive to be bought privately from British Railways, and Alan Pegler struck a unique deal which would allow him to continue to use it on their tracks until 1971. He was a member of the Eastern Regional Board and paid £3,000 for the locomotive in working condition. Before taking the locomotive over, he organised a special non-stop journey from King's Cross Station to Doncaster, where the locomotive would pass out of national ownership into his hands. The run attracted massive attention and took place just as the cold winds blew in the start of the 1963 snows. The locomotive was in superb order and had been polished to perfection for this now legendary journey. From the train we can see the East Coast Main Line as it was at this critical time for the railways of Great Britain. After 15 years of public ownership, it was being transformed at a speed which had never been seen before. Steam was being phased out rapidly, and the last of Flying Scotsman's classmates would be withdrawn shortly. Just 5 would survive into 1965 and 1 into 1966. The general public, who had turned more rapidly than anyone had thought to the car, were just enjoying the start of the swinging 60s, and the latest craze was for a music band from Liverpool, known as the Beatles. Steam and the railways generally belonged to another era entirely, and only the loco spotters and their dads really mourned the change on the railways. British Railways was seen as the harbinger of the end of railways in Britain. His fortunes were at such a low ebb that modernisation barely made inroads into the public consciousness. Dr. Beeching was expected to deliver a devastating report into the condition of the railways, and the government wanted to curb their apparently never-ending and escalating losses. So Flying Scotsman's last run was the last run for the traditional railway as well. The downturn in the railway's fortunes would also have a devastating effect on the towns and businesses which had been built up alongside them. Peterborough and Doncaster were both important locomotive servicing points and junctions, and Doncaster had the great locomotive workshops. Both would lose many jobs. No one loved British Railways in its image, and one of the first things Alan Pegler was to do with the engine upon acquiring it was to remove the double exhaust and deflectors to restore Flying Scotsman to its original form and to its original livery, celebrating the great days of the railways. Sadly, Alan Pegler's ownership would mirror this. A disastrous American tour with Flying Scotsman would bring him to penury and the loss of the locomotive itself.
But the days of steam are rapidly coming to an end. A sad thought for small boys, perhaps, but a glad thought for most who welcome the diesel locomotive as steam's successor. The familiar sight of the overall-clad crew is being replaced. If not exactly white-collar workers, they can certainly dress in accordance with the relatively clean conditions the job now provides. Apart from greater efficiency, the diesel engine means a better life for the men who daily travel hundreds of miles, carrying you to all parts of the country. In the cab, for instance, are provided washing facilities, a far cry from the soot-caked conditions which for too long have been synonymous with a driver's life. There's the chance, too, to brew up before the long journeys. Instead of a footplate, there's a hot plate and a comfortable seat. The Deltic diesel, by the way, or on the way as it is now, is the most powerful locomotive in the world, capable of sustaining high speeds up to 100 miles an hour. Not that one particularly notices it, cushioned cosily in a compartment, but just for a moment, let's share the driver's viewpoint. Stations rush past, bridges disappear, miles melt away. The dynamic Deltic is part of the plan to make Britain's railways the world's best, and what a part it is playing. At this rate, the railway will soon be called the Speedway. But the Deltic, of course, is only part of the modernization program, typical of new ideas introduced daily in the race against time.
It was a race that Britain's railways were losing, particularly in the monetary states. Dr. Beeching had been appointed by an anxious government to see what could be done to stem them. The hastily revised modernisation plan had meant that locomotives such as the baby Deltics cost more money than they had ever saved by replacing steam, and the myriad of diesel types, as seen on parade at King's Cross, seemed to be as far from standardisation as had the steam fleets before them. The last locomotive seen here is a BTH Type 1, another disaster for the railways. The most prominent type of diesel seen here, besides the Deltics, is the Brush Type 2, another extremely expensive mistake by the British Transport Commission. After just a few years' service, all 263 locomotives had to have their original Merlys engines replaced by new English electric ones. The original plan to electrify the East Coast main line after the West Coast had been shelved, and so, as on the Western, diesels were to be the power for the foreseeable future. Fortunately, the East Coast had a few remarkable men running it, who were to make the very best of a very mixed bag of assets. Gerald Fiennes had seen the prototype Deltic locomotive produced by English Electric and seen its potential. With no electrification ahead, he had to formulate an alternative plan to replace the ageing Gresley Pacifics and, in the great East Coast tradition of using top-flight locomotives on the principal expresses, obtained permission to buy a fleet of 22 locomotives based on the prototype. In absolute contrast to the baby Deltics, which had a smaller version of the Deltic engine, which proved to be extremely unreliable, the production Deltics were a complete success and were to hold the fort on the East Coast main line for nearly 2 decades. Deltics were very much in the Gresley mould. They were highly strung, having what were, for the railways at least, high-speed engines. As if to emphasise this, they bore names in the Gresley tradition as well, those allocated to the eastern region bearing the names of racehorses, as had the A3 Pacific, such as Flying Scotsman. The Scottish-based locomotives bore the names of Scottish regiments, and all the principal expresses on the East Coast Main Line were headed by these highly individual machines. They even sounded different, especially as, like the Western region's Western diesels, they had two engine units, which increased their reliability as the failure of one power unit didn't completely stop the locomotive, which could proceed at reduced power on the other engine. The Deltics, despite replacing the much-loved East Coast Pacifics, were one of the few diesel locomotive types which were actually welcomed by the railway enthusiast community. They were used in publicity by the East Coast management and kept in immaculate condition. Their most famous duty was on the Flying Scotsman train, for which a magnificent winged thistle headboard was created. The East Coast management instigated a programme of upgrading its route in the absence of a complete rebuild such as the West Coast was enjoying. Incremental improvements enabled them to take full advantage of the Deltic's maximum speed of 100 miles an hour, the only first-generation diesels to be permitted to run at that speed. And so the East Coast Main Line's immediate future was secured, with the Deltics in service in time for the 1961 summer service, just before the new chairman of British Railways was appointed, Dr. Richard Beeching. Could he help the railways to recover? In January 1963, Great Britain was shrouded in snow. The railways were battling for survival after unprecedented falls in their revenue and were under investigation by their own chairman. Would they be able to dig their way out and climb back to prosperity, both metaphorically and physically? 18 months earlier, a new chairman had been appointed to oversee British Railways, a successor to Sir Brian Robertson, who had presided over the national concern since 1953, a period during which it had gone from profit to loss and from an old-fashioned steam railway to something that was neither old or new-fashioned. The railways were sick indeed, and the new chairman was a doctor, Dr. Richard Beeching, and he was charged with curing British Railways and taking it out of the doldrums and to bring it back to health. Dr. Beeching wasn't a medical doctor. but a doctor of physics, and had made his name as technical director of the country's biggest chemicals company, ICI. He had spent those 18 months making a detailed investigation into all aspects of the railways and was due to announce his findings in March 1963. In January of that year, the weather had succeeded in doing what Dr. Beeching would shortly try to do: shut down much of the railway network of the country. The railwaymen knew how to fight back against the weather and turned out in force to dig the trains out of trouble. These scenes took place in Scotland, but, as we'll see, the snows covered the entire country down to the south coast. As the road transport of the country, known to be the Conservative government's preferred form of transport, ground to a halt, the railwaymen performed Herculean tasks to get their services running again. The newsreels recorded it all in black and white, just like the countryside, and how Dr. Beeching would spell out his findings.
Scotland's been suffering its worst blizzard for 10 years. So heavy was the snowfall that 4 trains were held up. Here's one on the Perth-Aberdeen line being dug out when we flew over. Over 30 main roads have been blocked and traffic, of course, very seriously disrupted. Impossible in many places to get supplies through to isolated farms and villages. 6 deaths due to the blizzard are reported. Where roads are not snowbound, icy surfaces have made driving an absolute menace. As well as Scotland, large areas of the north of England were also badly affected. And here's you-know-who doing you-know-what.
The Met Office reported that this was the coldest winter over England and Wales since 1740, and none colder has been recorded since. 1947 was the closest to it, and as in 1947, anticyclones to the north and east of the British Isles brought bitterly cold winds from the east day after day. Also like 1947, depressions followed tracks to southward of the British Isles, and their fronts brought snow to England, Wales and the southernmost parts of Scotland. The average maximum temperatures for January 1963 were more than 5 degrees centigrade below the seasonal average over most of Wales, the Midlands and southern England, and in some places more than 7 degrees below average. The story was much the same in February. Winter had begun suddenly, just before Christmas 1962, following a long period of stormy weather since the beginning of the month. The belt of rain over northern Scotland on Christmas Eve turned to snow as it moved south, giving Glasgow its first white Christmas since 1938. The snow belt reached southern England on Boxing Day and became almost stationary. The following day, a foot of snow blanketed most of southern England. Blizzards over the southwest of England and South Wales on the 29th and 30th of December brought snowdrifts 20 feet deep. Villages were cut off, some for several days. Roads and railways were blocked, telephone wires were brought down, stocks of food ran low. Farmers couldn't reach their livestock, thousands of sheep, ponies and cattle starved to death. Nothing moved. The railways were the first to get moving once again and proved to be a lifeline, especially to people in rural or remote areas. People who had for years turned their backs on the railways turned to them once again in their hour of need. Only the trains could provide them with essentials, and only by train could they move around the land. January saw snowfalls throughout the country, and more heavy snow fell in early February. In the southwest of Scotland, a Stranraer passenger service became trapped in heavy drifts at Bar Hill. A helicopter was used to rescue some passengers, whilst others were rescued by a team from Girvan. This line reopened on the 10th of February, but was closed again on the 13th after more blizzards. Air to Stranraer services were rerouted via Kilmarnock and Dumfries, the direct route not being available for another week. In England, the Settle and Carlisle route was blocked from Dent to the summit at Aysgill, and wasn't reopened until February the 23rd, when 5 trains were trapped in Devon as the blizzard of February the 5th moved south. Southern electric services were disrupted by ice on the conductor or third rails. Points would freeze over and locomotives would run through the night hours in an attempt to prevent this. The cold weather played havoc with the new diesels. If they avoided damage to their power units and cooling system, they were usually deployed on freight work as their sensitive train heating boilers would freeze. Steam locomotives which had already been withdrawn were, if possible, reinstated, even when in poor condition. The The problems resulting from the snow were compounded by the length of time it was there and the sheer amount of it. Some steam locomotives had to be brought in from far afield, examples being locomotives from Manchester, Carlisle and Shrewsbury being sent south to run the commuter services from Euston to Watford, Tring and Northampton. But even steam locomotives weren't entirely free from problems associated with the cold. Water supplies would freeze, coal could freeze into well-nigh solid heaps, and supplies from the mines were restricted. The countryside seen here is that of the southern part of England, and we are travelling on a Western Region train from the west to London. As can be seen, the snow was evenly spread along the route, and by this time, mid-February, the railway had been reasonably well cleared and was able to function normally. However, as in 1947, so it was in this winter. Brief thaws occurred from time to time, and winter didn't fully relax its grip before early March. During that time, whilst road traffic would only venture out once the black ice and frozen roads had been gritted, the railway's main concern was frozen points and signalling. The Met Office records that in the last few days of February and the first few days of March 1963, sunny weather brought afternoon temperatures of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, but clear skies allowed temperatures to plummet at night. Frosts were moderate or severe. At last, on the 4th of March, a mild southwesterly flow of air reached the British Isles. There was occasional rain that day in most parts of Britain, and further rain the following day in the west and north, this time prolonged. On the 6th of March there was no frost anywhere in the British Isles, and the temperature in London reached 17 degrees centigrade, the highest since the 25th of October 1962. The coldest winter over England and Wales since 1740, and the coldest over Scotland since 1879, had ended. With the thaw came flooding, but nothing like the scale of the 1947 floods. Soon after the winter of 1962-3, life returned to normal. But not for the railways. It was well known that Dr. Beeching, appointed chairman of BR in June 1961, had been gathering data which boded ill for the future. His report was due later that same month, and leaks indicated that it would be devastating. But first, he had a date with the Queen.
Mr. Marples, Minister of Transport, presents Dr. Beeching and his deputy, Sir Philip Water, to the Queen. Her Majesty, visiting the eastern region of British Railways, went from Liverpool Street Station to Stratford. First stop was to look at diesel engines at the maintenance depot. Then to the control tower at the Temple Mills marshalling yard. She watched typical operations in progress, including wagon retarders at work. Many other aspects of railway work that seldom come to public notice were on the programme of the Queen's visit. During it, she accepted a model engine. It should amuse the Prince of Wales over his convalescence.
Dr. Beeching had spent 18 months examining all aspects of British Railways operations, and was to publish his findings on March the 27th, 1963. They did indeed make devastating reading for supporters of the railways. We have to apologise for the quality of the next piece, a television news report, and as for its contents...
Highlands will lose their services. North of Aberdeen, very few will be left. Little more than the main north-south links will remain. Many of the country services are doomed. West country share the fate of many market towns. No station, no passenger trains. Lose money. Many of them carry less than a single bus could do. A good deal of the total saving of about 100 millions a year will come here. Neither commuters nor holidaymakers pay their way either. In London they almost do, but nowhere else. Higher fares are clearly threatened. Despite modernisation, the parcel services don't pay either. But the lessons have been learnt. Proper handling and faster trains are the new style. Over now to something that does pay, coal. Indeed, on running costs, it pays nearly 25 millions a year, and the railways hope to improve on this by running through trains. The old goods wagon is out of date, slow, cumbersome, unprofitable. There are too many depots. 900 will be cut to about 100 main ones. Big through trains taking boxcars from road vehicles will speed the traffic and cut the pilfering. The new device will be the liner train, so-called. A goods train running on a timetable, carrying special containers with rapid handling at both ends of the journey. It may cost 100 millions to put the system in. The present annual loss of 140 millions a year will not be wiped out, but by 1970, most of it should be gone. The railwaymen themselves are now faced with this prospect of another 70,000 jobs being lost to this industry. Do you believe that they'll go along with you in this plan?
I think they can. I don't think that they will put their heads in the sand and keep them there. I think that these proposals are in the long-term interests of railwaymen. I think they'll go along with us, but it does present them with a very great difficulty.
Unsurprisingly, the findings of the Reshaping of British Railways report were generally accepted by the government. Summing it up, the closure of 2,300 stations and 800 freight depots was envisaged. Passenger services would be withdrawn from 266 lines and 71 others modified. Within 3 years, the coaching stock would be reduced by 15,000 vehicles and wagons by 350,000. However, the current stock of 1,700 mainline diesels would be increased to about 4,000, but steam, already being phased out rapidly, would go even quicker than before, as the closures would make the overall requirement for locomotives far less. However, the British public, despite having been warned and despite their apparent disregard of the railways, were soon up in arms. Suddenly, people who hadn't used a train for years were forming committees to save their local lines, everyone now seeming to be a special case. But deserted trains, even when modern diesel railcars had been put in charge, told their own stories, and most of Dr. Beeching's findings were irrefutable. The first closures, after a suitable public hearing in front of transport users' consultative committees, were upheld, and closures started in 1964. Some lines which were to be retained were drastically pruned. Double-track main lines, in particular the Southern's West of England main line, would be reduced to just a single line of rails, with many wayside stations closed completely. There were a few notable exceptions. If Beeching was to have his way, all trains and railways in the north and west of Scotland would go. The scenic road to the Isles via Fort William and Mallaig was one such route. It had never been profitable, and the government at the end of the 19th century had been compelled to give guarantees and support to the North British Railway, as it was considered to be of the utmost importance that the West Highlands be opened up due to the poverty of the region. This time the railway was saved by the announcement that a new factory was to be opened at Corpac near Fort William by Scottish Pulp Developments Limited in 1964, and British Railways guaranteed to maintain it for 22 years so it could service the pulp mills. The pulp mill actually only lasted until 1981, but its very existence saved the railway. The timber traffic on the West Highland was an example of the type of freight traffic which was well suited to the railway, and this became a very efficient self-contained operation. Lest it be thought that the Beeching report, as the Reshaping of British Railways was popularly known, was entirely negative, it should be pointed out that it had many positive aspects as well. What Beeching said was that the railway should only carry the kind of traffic for which it was most suitable, and that underused or redundant assets should be disposed of. The latter included the lines and stations to be closed, but the kind of traffic for which it was most suitable should not only be kept but developed. This included much freight, particularly dedicated bulk flows such as the timber traffic seen here. Environmental considerations were a thing of the future. Modern handling methods would reduce the dependence on the railway's real bête noire, staff. Investment in machinery would cut staff numbers and improve efficiency. Investment in new freight rolling stock, dedicated to its role, bigger and able to travel at higher speeds, would cut transit times and make the railways more competitive with road transport. What would go were the old-fashioned small wagons which still made up the bulk of British Railways' wagon fleet, together with the numerous local goods yards that accompanied almost every station. As a side effect of this, the land vacated by the goods yards could be profitably converted to car parking to accommodate motorists who would thus be encouraged to drive to the station to take the train for the bulk of the journey. Critics said that the report failed to take account of the feeder nature of branch line railways, which produced the revenue for the main lines, but Beeching foresaw that the car could be harnessed to the advantage of the railways in this way, whilst divesting them of expensive branches which still cost the railways money in real terms. However, experience showed that once in a car, a driver would use it for the full journey, so the railways lost out altogether. Beeching also expected local bus services, which would be set up to replace local and branch rail services, to become integrated with the railway. But this never happened, and many bus-to-station services were soon withdrawn, leaving large parts of the country with no public transport at all. The railway's own internal traffic would continue, but the maintenance of tracks would be streamlined. Again, new methods of working and the investment in modern mechanical equipment would take priority, as this was another way of reducing the dependence on staff. One particular development which was to be accelerated was the relaying of track with what were known as long welded rails, which have since become the modern form of permanent way. The long rails both improve the standard of comfort for the passenger, reduce the maintenance of the track itself, and spread the load, allowing heavier vehicles on the track and thus further increasing efficiency. There was a considerable amount of the report devoted to what kinds of rail freight traffic should be developed. Much had already been done to improve this under the modernisation plan, even though it had taken a number of wrong turns along the way. The worst was the construction of vast marshalling yards, some of which were still being completed at the time the Beeching report was published. This effectively made them obsolete before they were even ready for use, as it advocated the elimination of the kinds of traffic which required marshalling, and the promotion of bulk traffic such as this cement train, which would go from loading point to terminal without a break in its journey. Another cost reduction which the new wagons would eventually allow was the elimination of the traditional guards van at the tail of every freight train. Historically, these had been known as brake vans, as that was their purpose when freight trains consisted of unbraked wagons, and the guard was a vital part of the team in keeping a train under control. With the advent of modern, continuously braked wagons, the guard became as redundant as the fireman in the cab of a locomotive. All these proposals were understood by the Conservative government, which was looking primarily at ways to save money. In 1960 the losses had amounted to £68 million, in 1961 £87 million, and in 1962 £104 million, the latter equivalent to more than £1 billion at today's prices. Beeching expected the costs to rise briefly, whilst his so-called axe was swung, but that the railway would thus be steered back to profit, or at least to stop losing money. By contrast, the motor industry was expanding rapidly during this time and even became a customer of the railway. The railway closures would become extremely political. The government was all for cutting services and lines, but was very reluctant to provide capital funds to invest in the services and renewals which Dr. Beeching wanted to make to improve the remaining parts of the network. The modernisation plan had been formulated back in 1955 and had committed £1.5 billion to be spent over the following 15 years. It still had 6 years to go, so the government didn't want to spend yet more money. But, a year after the report, at the height of the time when railway closures were being proposed or implemented, the Conservative government had to fight an election. They lost by a tiny margin. It seems likely that the plight of the railways was a decisive factor in that defeat, as the incoming Labour administration, heavily backed by the trades unions, had made an election pledge to look again at the Beeching plan. Perhaps the fact that the Conservative Transport Minister, Ernest Marples, was a major road contractor also helped swing the electorate. In the event, the figures in the plan were difficult to argue against, and the new government made very few changes to the proposals. Ironically, its trade union support was now largely from members in the road transport sector. The railway stood little chance of a major backtracking in policy. The report showed that half of British Railway's 7,000 stations produced just 2% of the total passenger traffic. 25% of traffic started at just 34 stations. 1/3 of the track carried just 1% of the traffic, and 1/2 didn't even carry sufficient traffic to cover its maintenance costs. Less than 1/3 of all carriages were in full-time use, many being reserved for summer or peak services only. The network of 18,000 miles of railway should be reduced by 1/3, which would be barely half of the total mileage of the system at its peak at the outbreak of the First World War, when there were 23,440 route miles. Routes needed at least 10,000 passengers a week just to break even, according to the report. The appendix to the report listed more than 2,000 stations and 250 train services which should be withdrawn on purely economic grounds. Closures couldn't be implemented immediately. Each closure had to be published and then considered by the transport users' consultative committees as to whether withdrawal of passenger services would cause hardship to users. The doctor hoped 70% of his closures would be complete by the end of 1964, and all within 3 years. The advent of a Labour government merely slowed this a little, at first. Beeching produced a second report the following year, 1965, entitled The Development of the Major Railway Trunk Routes, in which he proposed even greater cuts, leaving vast swathes of the country such as Cornwall, East Anglia, Yorkshire and most of Scotland and Wales without rails. Just 3,000 miles would be developed and the total would shrink to 7,500 miles. It would involve even more investment, but was a step too far for the government and was rejected. Feeling rejected personally and realising he was out of step with the times, Dr. Richard Beeching, who had been seconded to British Railways by ICI, returned to that company in June 1965. Once it had decided that Beeching was right and ditching its election promises, the Labour government set to with a will to continue to implement the proposals. In fact, it sped them up. The railways had no friends in government, and this was merely confirmed when a snap election in 1966 returned Harold Wilson's party with a vastly increased majority. Railwaymen were on the back foot, and the railways were retrenching and contracting. Surprisingly, there were some odd survivals, such as the sand trains in rural Staffordshire, which would last for another 20 years or more. One little-known passage in the Beeching report hinted at an alternative way to view the loss-making lines. This was to treat those lines which the public recognised served a social need as a special case, and for some form of formal public subsidy to be set up. This would be taken up by the second Labour government, with Barbara Castle as Transport Secretary, and enacted in the 1968 Transport Act. This created the Passenger Transport Executives, PTEs, empowering local authorities in major cities to subsidise and invest in important routes. A system of public service obligation grants was set up to allow rural routes to remain open in the public interest, and this would be the foundation of all railway financing thereafter, as governments at last came to the conclusion that railways would never pay their way, but were an essential public service. Perhaps the best-known positive aspects and recommendations of the Beeching report were the proposals to introduce the very cost-effective merry-go-round coal trains and liner services. The merry-go-round principle involved further investment by two other nationalised industries besides the railways, the Central Electricity Generating Board, the CEGB, and the National Coal Board, NCB. Coordination of the three was seen as beneficial by the government, and the system was quickly implemented. The merry-go-round system consisted of a series of trains of dedicated coal hopper wagons running continuously from coal mine to power station non-stop. At the terminals, the trains would run under loading or unloading facilities at a steady slow speed, typically half a mile an hour, whilst the wagons would be loaded from or to hoppers, which would be connected directly to the pit or power station. British Railways had to provide the trains and tracks. The latter comprised balloon tracks at the terminals to obviate any need to turn or run round the trains. The trains themselves consisted of a new design of hopper wagon with a capacity of 33 tons, double the capacity of the traditional mineral wagons. The wagons were fitted with air brakes from new. To work the trains, a number of new diesel locomotives were fitted with special electronic control gear to enable them to run at the constant slow speed needed for the operation. In England, these were members of the new standard Type 4 diesels, at the time known as the Brush Type 4. They were a second-generation design, built and designed, at last, using the experience gained from the early pilot scheme and the subsequent panic order classes. They were to become the principal heavy freight engines of the 1960s, and were used on the new traffic flows, such as the merry-go-rounds, and bulk freight flows, such as this train of oil tanks, each of which could hold 100 tons of the black gold. These were the first taste of the wagons of the future, with continuous air brakes and running on bogies rather than the simple four-wheel chassis of older stock. As a result, they could run at express speeds. The locomotives first appeared in 1962. D1500 was released from Brush Engineering's Loughborough Works on the 28th of September that year, and was the first of 512 locomotives built by 3 different builders. The class was used on all non-electrified lines around the country, the West Coast Main Line being the only one on which they were rarely seen. On that line, the wires were soon being erected on the lines south of Crewe to Euston, their ultimate goal. The Brush Type 4 wasn't the end of locomotive development by the enterprising manufacturer. In 1966, now part of the Hawker Siddeley Group, it started work on the most powerful diesel locomotive yet to have been seen on Britain's railways, the prototype 4,000 horsepower Kestrel. It was unveiled to the press at Marylebone Station.
London, just as perfect for those who want to sit around and go places at high speed. It's the Kestrel, the world's most powerful single-engine diesel-electric locomotive. Built by Hawker Siddeley as a private venture, it is thought that there'll be a big overseas market for the engine. British Rail are already very interested. Cruising speed is 110 miles an hour. Now to try it out. There's 4,000 horsepower tucked away inside the Kestrel, all of it taking the strain easily as she glides away from Marylebone Station on a demonstration run. With a few more like the Kestrel around, perhaps those timetables might come true.
New British Railways uniforms to herald new standards in passenger comfort. They call it the Train of Tomorrow. 8 specially built coaches, diesel-powered, and demonstrated for us during a run from London. Easier to get on and get off thanks to the wide folding doors, the train is going into service in different parts of the country, and passengers will be asked for their reactions. This is the second-class accommodation. Seats have been scientifically designed, while there's forced air heating and ventilation, special soundproofing, more civilized, easy-to-clean toilets. A smoother, quieter ride, big panoramic windows with blinds if you feel like a snooze, and partial double glazing too. In fact, it's British Railways' formula for attracting travellers back to trains. They're claimed to be among the best designed coaches in the world.
This Train of Tomorrow, again headed by a Brush locomotive, was the XP64, which was to launch the new look of British Railways. The new symbol, a double arrow, made its first appearance, and the coaches, although based on Mark I underframes, were built to test out proposed features for the second generation of standard coaches, the Mark IIs. This was the start of a complete overhaul of the railway's image to bring it into the modern era, and it was time to prepare the way for the completion of the flagship project of the modernisation plan, electric trains all the way to London Euston, itself completely remodelled for the new trains.
Euston Station, British Rail's gateway to the north and entrance to a new era of high-speed train travel. The London Midland region has gone electric, slashing the travelling time between London, Liverpool and Manchester to provide the fastest service in railway history between these cities. For driver Graham and his colleagues on the express routes, new electric locomotives capable of sustained high speeds will enable them to complete the journey between London and the northern cities in 2.5 hours. The overhead electrification system has cost £175 million. It is one of the most modern of its kind in the world, incorporating signal boxes with equipment that wouldn't look out of place at Cape Kennedy. Passenger comfort has also been given priority with new coaches, restaurant cars and sleeping accommodation rolling on continuous welded rail to give a smoother, more silent ride. From the driver's viewpoint, this is what it looks like up front at 100 miles an hour.
None of this razzmatazz could take away the importance of the other changes going on the railways. The largely unsung ancillary services were undergoing massive changes, many as a result of the Beeching report. Although to all appearances the traditional railway was to the fore, Beeching had recognised that the labour-intensive freight handling techniques had to change, and he identified the containerisation of freight traffic as the way ahead for the system. The railway would have no further need for the somewhat antiquated road vehicles with which it was saddled, as customers would present the containers at the railway's premises using their own transport. Containers would eliminate the form of loading seen here, as it would be done at the point of origin rather than on the railway. This is actually one of the new style containers being loaded for demonstration purposes. Beeching used the term liner trains for the proposed new container system. International dimensions and fixings had not yet been agreed for the actual containers, the most common of which were known as ISO containers. These were based on American practice and had standard height and width dimensions of 8 feet and lengths in multiples of 10 feet. These would present British Railways with some problems, as one of these units mounted on a normal British wagon would foul the British loading gauge, the maximum dimensions a vehicle could obtain without touching lineside features such as bridges and tunnels. But this could be overcome. Since this was a whole new concept, new vehicles and new facilities could be designed from the ground up, which is exactly what happened. A complete network of liner train terminals would be built at strategic locations around the country, in key cities and ports, to enable the containers to be transshipped as simply as possible. The terminals would handle ship-to-road traffic at the ports as well as ship-to-train. The new concept was then given an appropriate name, Freightliner. The special overhead cranes soon became a familiar sight at ports such as Southampton, Tilbury and Felixstowe, and manufacturing cities such as Leeds, Glasgow and Manchester. Road transport was as quick as the railway to adopt the concept, and for once, road and rail worked in harmony. After so many years of abstracting traffic from the railways, road transport now provided them with traffic. Beeching was right. Liner trains and container transport were the future. The first liner trains were ordered in 1964, and the Freightliner service was launched in 1965. Freightliner built special wagons for the new services, which had small wheels to allow for low floors and tall containers. Since the world market for containers was still very diverse, Freightliner produced its own version of the ISO standard, but not fully compliant, notably in the mounting points. Thus, the early Freightliner trains boasted containers displaying the Freightliner name. It would take some years for standardization to be applied, and to this day European containers differ from American ISO ones. The Freightliner containers were initially produced in 2 lengths, 20 foot and 27 foot. Height and width matched the ISO ones. In addition to the closed containers, some open types, which were more akin to large pallets, were produced. Their lives were short though, as users soon appreciated the security benefits of enclosed containers. Both the brush-type 4s and the new electric locomotives were allocated to the new trains, and the appearance of long trains with containers, all in an identical and very strikingly modern livery, was used to good effect by BR's publicity department. At last they had a state-of-the-art freight train and could banish the 19th century derived 4-wheel wagon load train to the lesser parts of the system. This was the first flowering of the fight back, which had been so long in coming. The first Freightliner train ran from London to Glasgow on the 15th of November 1965, exactly 1 week before the full electrified service from London to Crewe was inaugurated. The initial terminals were located with a view to inland domestic traffic. Freightliner had also invested in some road tractor units for these early services, and also encouraged a number of road haulage companies to acquire compatible units. Freightliner wasn't initially set up as an independent brand within the British Railways structure, but was what would later become known as a profit centre. Perhaps its most important factor was that it was a completely new concept, owing nothing to traditional working practices, despite the fact that containers had, as such, been in use on Britain's railways from the time of grouping. The Freightliner network was set up on the basis of a national railway system, ignoring all regional boundaries and traditions. In this it was unique. It symbolised the change in attitude from the old railway loyalties and looked forward. It was aggressive in its approach to acquiring traffic and used modern marketing methods to attain this. One oddity seen on these early Freightliner trains is the use of a passenger brake van. The issue of the elimination of the guard on a freight train was still being discussed with the unions, and thus a guard was still obligatory for Freightliner trains, although completely unnecessary. The trains were in effect built to passenger train standards and ran to passenger train speeds and to regular timetables. Not a first for Britain's railways, but certainly a new concept insofar as the entire network was concerned. The passenger brake vans had to be used as the traditional goods brake vans were unsuitable for high speed, and the redundancy of these vehicles in the Freightliner concept is evidenced by their use at the head of the train in many instances. Freightliner trains would be the first to eliminate them, the general process of taking them off all freight trains taking many years to come to fruition. Expansion of the network was spread over its first year of operations. The next service to be launched after the London to Glasgow one was from London to Manchester, starting in February 1966. Other services followed. London to Liverpool commenced in June. Services between the new centres were started in September between Liverpool and Glasgow, Manchester and Glasgow a week later, and from London to Aberdeen at the end of October. By the end of that year, around 27,000 loaded containers had been carried on the liner trains. Being launched concurrently with the completion of the electrification of the core part of the West Coast Main Line, the Freightliner concept was very much bound up in the attempts to relaunch the railway's image. In addition to these two achievements, the nationalised concern had been completely rebranded during 1965. At the beginning of the year, it had been renamed and would henceforth have the snappier title of British Rail rather than British Railways. This resulted in quite animated correspondence in the press for some while, which helped to emphasise that the railways were changing, and at last for the better. The rebranding took place while Dr. Beeching was still chairman, so much of the credit for its success should be laid at his door. All that remained to be completed in this first phase of West Coast electrification was the original London and Birmingham railway route through Birmingham from Rugby. One noticeable feature of the West Coast Main Line as it made its way northwards from London was the proximity of the Grand Union Canal. It was along this stretch that one of the most famous instances of theft in Great Britain took place when the Great Train Robbery was staged. Since the earliest days of railways, the Royal Mail had entrusted its precious cargo to the railway companies. A tradition had built up and was jealously guarded. An elaborate system for the transfer of mail on the move allowed trains to pick up or drop off mailbags without losing speed, and this was seen as a very important business source for the railways, so much so that it wasn't even questioned in the Beeching report. Mailbags were hung from special gantries at the side of the line at locations such as Penrith in Cumbria, which didn't merit a special stop. The process was considered to be quite alarming, and some post office staff would ask others to do the work for them. As the train approached the line-side apparatus, the staff inside the train would deploy nets from the side of the coach to collect the bags. Once the bags had been captured, the coach side could be sealed and the bags moved inside the train to the sorting areas. Known as the Travelling Post Office or TPO, the trains were equipped with special vehicles to effect the transfer and a series of sorting vans in which post office staff could sort the mail whilst on the move. Inside the vans were rows of sorting boxes which were similar to those used in normal, static post offices. An elaborate network of trains ran every night, making connections at intermediate junctions, and the mail had to be sorted as expeditiously as possible to be ready for transfer at these locations. Working throughout the night, the men of the TPO were a special breed. A great sense of pride in the job meant that many would work on these services throughout their working lives. Like all post office staff, they worked for the post office and not the railway. They knew the geography of the country intimately. The letters and packages handled on the trains had already been pre-sorted into local and national mail at the collecting offices, and the on-train staff's job was to resort the latter into receiving areas. A further sort would be required at the receiving centres and a final sort at the delivery offices. Intermediate sorts on the trains would be made to effect transfers at the major hubs, such as Crewe, where we see the Scottish TPO calling in the middle of the night. There were 3 types of dedicated TPO vehicle. The most unusual were the vans which collected the mails, with their collecting nets and apparatus. Joined to these via offset corridor connectors, which were fitted so that the vans could only be used with one another, were the sorting vans, in which the work was done. Some of these had mailboxes in the side, which meant that members of the public could post their mail directly into the train for an additional fee. The final type of van was the stowage van, in which the bags to be sorted and the bags which had been sorted were kept. These would be the vans from which the nighttime exchanges at intermediate stations took place. The trains ran to a tight timetable, and the schedules, whilst not publicised, could be easily obtained by those who wanted to know where the trains would be and when. Amongst those who wanted to know was a gang of London criminals. The night mail was known to carry valuable registered mail, including a large amount of cash, which was sorted in a specific sorting van known as a high-value package van. On the night of 7th of August 1963, the up TPO from Glasgow to London had an unusually large amount of these packages containing cash, as there had just been a bank holiday in Scotland. One of the gang had spent some months befriending TPO and railway staff, and thus knew that this would be the particular train to rob. The usual value of the packages was in the region of £300,000, but on this occasion it was £2.3 million, which equates to 30 million today. The robbers stopped the train by tampering with a signal to make the driver, Jack Mills, apply the brakes. Boarding the train, they forced him to drive it further towards London to an overbridge, where they had vans and cars waiting. The press had a field day, making folk heroes of the robbers, even though they had ruined the life of driver Jack Mills as they coshed him during the robbery, contributing to his early death in 1970. On a lighter note, we can now examine other ways in which the new British Rail tried to make money from its erstwhile rival, the motor car. Motor rail was the name coined in 1966 to publicise the expansion of a service which had been offered from 1955 on the London to Perth route. The expansion centred on a new terminal at Kensington Olympia, from which a number of new services were to start to places such as Penzance, Plymouth, Carlisle, Glasgow and Inverness. Although it was expensive to use, there was something to be said about taking your car on the train in the 1960s, the era of massive traffic jams before the construction of much of the motorway network.
You'll want the car when you're in Scotland, Cornwall or North Wales, but why not avoid the strain of a long drive by putting it on the train and relaxing in comfort till you get there? Kensington Olympia is the first motor rail terminal in the world. This particular station was chosen for the purpose because it connects with all rail arteries. The Cartic double-decker truck is not too high for mainline bridges or tunnels. When British Rail have enough of them, they will replace the car single-decker. It's been possible to put the car on the train for some years past, but these are the first trains exclusively for the purpose in Britain, operating from their own terminal. On a demonstration run to Newbury, car owners sampled luxury travel in the comfortable knowledge that their auto would be with them at the destination. What a contrast, these summertime traffic jams. They get worse every year. The motor rail will help to relieve them. Not so long ago, the motorist used to congratulate himself on being independent of trains and timetables. Road congestion has made him think again. Getting the car off the train is as quick and easy as putting it on. It looks a great idea.
The Beeching plan for closing hundreds of miles of unprofitable railway lines has given inventors plenty of food for thought. One bright idea is the railmobile, an invention which allows the motorist to drive his car along the railway lines. The car's rear wheels transfer the power through rollers to the trolley. Incredible to think that a baby car can drive a trolley weighing 1.5 tons, but here we go. It's effortless motoring, all right, and it opens up endless possibilities for getting about the country. 60 miles an hour on the clock gives an actual trolley speed around 30. And if this car's gone loco, then here's one that's plainly right round the bend.
Seeing this chap on a bike is almost prophetic. Railways cut by Beeching's axe would one day become cycle tracks across the country, as people would seek ways to travel without damaging the environment. But before that, the tracks and Britain's beloved steam engines would have to go. From the time of nationalisation, the fortunes of Great Britain's once profitable railways had been falling into loss, and much of the blame was placed on the steam locomotive and the paraphernalia which accompanied it. British Railways had made a determined effort to stamp out this scourge. Only by eliminating steam could its wonderful new railway rise again. In fact, it wasn't just the steam locomotive that BR wanted to eliminate. It had inherited a railway system which hadn't really changed in essence from Victorian days, and it still had plenty of Victorian buildings, Victorian equipment and Victorian attitudes when the second half of the 20th century came along. In 1955, the British Transport Commission had announced its modernisation plan, under which it proposed to replace steam with electrics wherever possible, and with diesels where it wasn't possible. It expected this to take about 25 to 30 years. It didn't. Just 13 years after the plan was announced, the last steam locomotives were retired. At the time British Railways rebranded itself as British Rail, on the 1st of January 1965, there were still steam locomotives working on every region of the system, but not everywhere on the system. On the newly electrified West Coast Main Line, steam locomotives had been banned from working under the wires. Many of the survivors were even branded to show their inferior status by the simple expedient of having a broad yellow stripe painted on their cab sides across their numbers. It was hardly necessary, as all railway staff knew they couldn't run under the wires anyway. The great electrification project on the West Coast Main Line had only been authorised as far as Weaver Junction, just to the south of Warrington. It was therefore on this northern part of the network where steam would stage its last stand. To the generations of boys for whom railways were an obsession, the word hobby seems to be insufficient as a description of their passion. The most exciting place to be was the loco yard, or more correctly, the engine shed. It was in these cathedrals of steam that the steam locomotives were serviced, cleaned and occasionally repaired. Day-to-day servicing included taking on water and coal, filling the sandboxes to enable a steam locomotive to grip the rails in slippery conditions, cleaning them and disposing them at the end of a tour of duty or preparing them before one. Steam locomotives were allocated to individual sheds and bore small cast metal plaques at the bottom of their smoke boxes showing this allocation. The shed was then responsible for keeping the locomotive in working condition and thus available for its required duties. The locomotive's number was displayed on a cast metal plate at the top of the smoke box. At the very end they became collector's items and were removed, as seen on, or rather not on, this Black 5. These number plates and allocation plaques were an inheritance from the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the largest company to form part of British Railways. Despite BR's programme of steam locomotive construction, its standard range, it was to be the LMS Black 5s built to the design of Sir William Stanier, which were to be the most numerous locomotives left on the last official working day of British steam on the 4th of August 1968. 1 week later, 3 of them would participate in the very final steam working of all, the so-called 15 Guineas Special, which was run over the famous Settle and Carlisle line to mark the end of working steam on British Railways. Although the Ivat Tank and 8F still had their smokebox number plates, by the end many locomotives were unidentifiable and their condition summed up all the reasons British Rail had given for its need to eliminate steam. When labour was cheap and plentiful, and the railways were seen as a well-paid and secure job for life, school leavers would sign up for a career with good prospects. The new recruit would undertake menial duties around the locomotive shed, such as cleaning out the ash pits into which the clinker and ash from the fireboxes of the locomotives would be thrown. He, only during the wars had women done this type of work, would then progress to being a cleaner, responsible for keeping the locomotives spick and span, and he'd also be responsible for cleaning out the ashes from them and also lighting them up. As a past cleaner, he would be able to do some work on the footplate around the shed environs. The next stage would bring him to the position of fireman, an arduous task for which fit young men were needed. Progressing to the top, he would first become a past fireman, who was passed to drive some locomotives, before finally ascending the ladder to become a driver. It took a working lifetime to reach the highest footplate position of all, a top link driver, at the regulator of the fastest express locomotives. At every grade there were variations, depending on what the principal work was at a specific shed: shunting, freight, local passenger or express passenger. In the heyday of the railways before the First World War, a top link driver was a very special kind of man with a position to which many youngsters aspired. The long climb up the promotion ladder was an accepted part of life and wasn't even questioned. But wartime changed all that, and working on a steam locomotive could be an arduous and dirty job. There were, of course, non-footplate jobs at the shed. Clerical staff were needed for wages work, rostering of locomotives, keeping the locomotive history records, and an overall man in charge, the shedmaster. But all had to work in the same conditions, conditions which the post-war generations had seen and rejected. Throughout its existence, British Railways had been faced with recruitment problems. It wasn't just the physical conditions which were a deterrent, the long time to climb the ladder was another. The lack of new staff meant that the conditions at the sheds grew worse over time, thus compounding the problem for the employer. It started in the cities, so the locomotives from city-based sheds were the first whose appearance started to fall off, whilst the country sheds were able to maintain standards for longer. But it was, above all, the massive amount of labour needed to keep steam operational that told against it, and the acceleration of the planned demise of steam wasn't simply a matter of vengeful management trying to destroy it. It was a matter of necessity. The first British Rail region to abolish steam was the Western. In the mid-1960s, the remaining steam locomotives were but a pale shadow of the once proud Great Western Fleet. Even the mighty castles were looking ready to meet their makers. This one, Gloucester Castle, had already lost its smokebox number plate whilst retaining its nameplates shortly before its September 1963 withdrawal. It was one of the last castles to be built and had a working life of just 14 years. The final Western Region steam passenger train was run on the 11th of June 1965 and was seen off in some style from Paddington Station. The locomotive was 7029 Cluncastle, which was to be purchased directly from service afterwards for the embryo Birmingham Railway Museum at the old Tyseley shed in that city. This wouldn't actually be Clun's last run on British Rail metals, as she would be kept in working condition at Tyseley and work a number of specials in the next few years across the network. Although this was the official end of steam passenger work on the Western Region, the actual end took place on the 6th of March 1966, when the Somerset and Dorset line, which had been passed to the Western Region, finally closed. But on the real Western, the old Great Western, the new order was to be seen at places such as Plymouth, where the new, or rebuilt in 1962, station was now the only station in the city, following closures as a result of the Beeching cuts. Warships in Plymouth could be seen on either the sea or the rails, as Western trains were still distinctive, boasting their own variation on the dieselisation policy in the form of the hydraulic classes. The warships were being used in multiple in the mid-1960s to speed up the principal trains to the West Country. Elimination of steam didn't just mean the elimination of steam locomotives. In particular, the great steam sheds were now redundant and the water cranes were pulled up and melted down for scrap, as were the tracks and the associated infrastructure. Sidings became redundant as the patterns of freight traffic moved rapidly away from pickup freights and local services, all condemned by Dr. Beeching as hopelessly uneconomic for the railways. In their place would come liner trains and bulk long-distance company trains. Shed buildings would be torn down, many sites simply then being left to go back to nature, as their soil had been contaminated after a century or more of sustained heavy industrial use. But it was the speed of change which struck many people. The railways pulled out of serving many shipping ports, leaving yet more land to be redeveloped. Particularly noticeable was the removal of the traditional semaphore signalling on most of the main lines. Over the previous century, semaphore signalling had been developed to a high standard, but its reliance on large staff numbers and its relatively high maintenance costs meant that it had to go. In any event, it was associated with the traditional railway, and there were members of the British Railways Board, the actual company name hadn't changed, who were known to be intent on eliminating any associations with the steam age as quickly as possible. Dr. Beeching hadn't specifically described semaphore signalling as one of the major expenses that British Rail should try to eliminate. His brief had been to make the railways pay, or more realistically, stop them losing money. His report concentrated on traffic flows and the costs of running branch lines, stations, types of traffic, and the occasional use of certain types of asset, such as coaching stock kept for seasonal trains and used as little as 18 times a year. Semaphore signalling was simply a major labour-intensive cost within the overall costs of running the railway. The removal of semaphore signalling didn't just mean the removal of signals. Important junctions and stations would have numerous signal boxes, and these would in general be demolished, as the new signalling would be electric colour light signals controlled remotely from signalling centres. The whole appearance of the railway was to change during the modernisation process. With the replacement of labour-intensive installations would go the need for many other buildings and equipment. Improvements in track technology and the use of on-track machinery to check track conditions would eliminate the need for linesmen, the staff who walked along the tracks every day to keep them in good order. Those men had needed mess rooms, equipment stores, lineside huts and offices. All these could go now. Many of the remaining stations, which used to boast large complements of staff, would have all their buildings demolished and just a simple shelter, similar to and known as a bus shelter, erected for passenger use. Along with these would go the goods yards as local freight operations ceased, and the whole effect was to change the face of the railways forever. But it was the elimination of steam and the reduction of the magnificent former kings of the rails that attracted the most attention.
Good old steam locos, nothing to touch them. Their days are numbered and the real veterans are being broken up. Here at Swindon, where many thousands have been built over the past 100 years or so, the old-timers are being turned into scrap. Rather sad, really, and it does seem a harsh fate after all the faithful service they've given. Most of this lot date from the 1920s, but they won't be quite forgotten. There's a big demand for the old number plates as souvenirs for collectors. Still, progress is progress, I suppose, and British Railways must diesel on.
During the 1960s, the sight of apparently modern steam locomotives being cut up for scrap was one which tore at the hearts of railway enthusiasts. One spin-off was that the nameplates became valuable souvenirs of once-loved locomotives, and a ready market began to appear. The value of these was going to grow during the decade, and it soon became accepted practice to remove them from steam locomotives which were still at work, to prevent them being acquired by souvenir hunters. By the end of steam, virtually none of them remained on the locomotives, and their poor condition made it extremely difficult to identify any individual machine. The scrapping of locomotives, while shocking to enthusiasts, was really just a part of the normal policy of renewal on the railways, and had been going on since the beginning. In fact, there was a certain bizarre fascination in observing the inner workings of the steam engine being revealed, as its outer parts were steadily stripped away. Although the modernisation plan of 1955 envisaged the elimination of steam, it hadn't forecast quite such a rapid reduction in the overall fleet as actually happened. In the early 1960s, the locomotives going to the torch were mostly engines inherited by the Big Four companies in 1923 from the original private companies. To these were soon added the earlier types produced by the Big Four themselves, the early LMS types seen here being particularly frequent members of the One-Way Journey Club. This was for a number of reasons, the first simply being that there were more of them. The LMS had been the biggest of the Big Four, and so it had more steam locomotives in its fleet. The second reason was that it had built a great number of already obsolescent locomotives in the early days of grouping, and these were always likely to be early candidates for withdrawal. A third reason was a logical extension of the others. Because it had so many obsolescent locomotives, the London Midland region was the subject of the largest part of the modernisation plan's investment in new diesel power, and of course the massive electrification programme associated with the West Coast Main Line. It should also be remembered that huge numbers of wagons were being cut up alongside the locomotives during the same period, as the modernisation plan's aim of reducing the old-fashioned wagon fleet was embarked upon, and this was to be accelerated considerably in the mid-1960s after the publication of the Beeching report. To the scrapman, the origin of the locomotive or wagon he's cutting up matters not a jot. Locomotives from different companies would be disassembled alongside one another with complete impunity. At the end of the day, they were merely sources of scrap material for recycling and from which to make a living. Actually, the latter was a phenomenon which only started to make itself felt in the 1960s as the reduction in the steam fleet gathered pace. Traditionally, steam locomotives tended to be scrapped at the same places where they had been built, the railway workshops. Over the years, many parts were simply removed from locomotives for reuse before the actual cutting took place, as standardisation had been in vogue on most railways well before the British Railways standard steam locomotive range was mooted. During the rundown of the BR fleet, there was little of this, other than the cannibalising of withdrawn locomotives to keep remaining members of their classes at work when still required. Long lines of locomotives awaiting their fate became a familiar sight around the railway workshops in the early 1960s, but they were soon to take up valuable working space. The works started to fall behind in scrapping, so British Railways started to look to other ways in order to speed the process up and rid itself of the unwanted locomotives. Private enterprise proved to be the solution. Numerous scrapyards existed around the country, and they were encouraged to start taking the redundant locomotives. Many existed in South Wales, which was the heart of the steel industry, and where there was always a demand for steel for recycling. Gradually, names such as Cashmore's in Newport, Birds of Risca, and Wards of Briton Ferry were added to the pantheon of names associated with the railways. These companies tended at first to deal with the locomotives on their own doorstep, but they were soon tendering for locomotives from across the nation, which would be delivered to them in sad convoys of dilapidated wrecks. Before the involvement of the South Wales scrapyards, Swindon Works had taken pride in the recycling of the locomotives it had built, as seen in the newsreel footage. The so-called dump outside the works had featured in many railway history books when the Great Western Railway had changed from the broad gauge to the standard gauge in the late 19th century. The locomotive boiler we see here, being dismantled in the 1960s, owed its design to the series of standard boilers introduced by Churchward in the first decade of the 20th century. In all essentials it boasted the same dimensions and design, although many improvements have been made over the next half-century. The standard GWR boilers have been moved from locomotive to locomotive as they were overhauled, many different classes using the same type of boiler. The boiler and other parts seen being cut up here could have come from any of those types of locomotive, as almost all the features of GWR locomotives were standardised: cylinders, wheels, bogies, cab size, tenders, and of course the boilers themselves. The pair of outside cylinders being cut here could have come from one of many apparently different types of Great Western locomotives. Like the boilers, the standard cylinders have been used on many locomotive types. Most of the parts used in new locomotives would have been fitted on earlier ones, although they've been subjected to modernisation and improvements in almost all essentials, with the exception of the dimensions. The result of this great standardisation policy, the most extensive in British railway history, was that the Great Western had kept an appearance of continuity whilst keeping up to date in engineering and operating practice. It would bear directly onto British Railway's own standardisation policies, as William Stanier was recruited by the LMS Railway in the 1930s from Swindon to rescue it from its appalling legacy. He introduced many features of the GWR's standardisation policy to LMS locomotives, which was subsequently continued by British Railways. So the word standard had originally meant Great Western to many railwaymen, and the most noticeable feature of standardisation was the boiler, which set the character of a locomotive. A major part of the Great Western's heritage was the decoration of its boilers. The standard locomotives were adorned with brass safety valve covers and, on the principal express types, copper cap chimneys. These, like the nameplates and number plates, would become collector's items, whilst the rest of the locomotives would be consigned to the scrap heap. But cutting up the boilers was the most difficult task. The last user of this standard number 1 boiler was Oakley Hall, which had been withdrawn from Gloucester Shed in January 1965 and dispatched, somewhat unusually still bearing its smokebox number plate, to Swindon for scrapping, which we see taking place barely a month later in February 1965. This was to be the last year in which scrapping took place at Swindon in large numbers because, as we've seen, Western Steam was to be finally withdrawn from the region by the middle of the year. Swindon, with the aid of some of the South Wales private yards, had kept up with the withdrawal programme remarkably well. One aspect of the steam locomotive would live on, in a very different form. The fireboxes, made of copper, would be recycled to make, amongst other things, the copper overhead wires used to transmit power to the new electric trains, which were now taking over in increasing numbers on the main lines. So perhaps it's now time to examine the state of the newer parts of the railway. As steam was finally phased out, the great West Coast electrification project was soon to be completed. From the middle of 1966, electric trains would leave from Euston Station for Liverpool and Manchester, and within a year the whole project would be completed. As always, the most visible part of the transition from the old to the new railway was the change in the locomotive fleet. On the West Coast, the original order for 100 electric locomotives of 5 main types had been followed up with a production order for 100 of a new type designed as a result of the experience gained from the earlier machines. The new locomotives were type AL6, and 60 were built by BR at Doncaster during 1965 and 66, whilst a further 40 came from English Electric during the same period. However, English Electric had missed out on the largest second-generation diesel order. The standard Type 4 order had been secured by Brush Traction of Loughborough, 512 examples of which were to be built there between 1962 and 1968. They were used on all parts of the system, only the West Coast main line seeing little of their presence. The southern region also saw few of them, as it had a single diesel type of its own, the Type 3 engines, which were commonly known as Cromptons on account of their power units. English Electric did, however, have the order for the standard Type 3 for the British Rail fleet, which was for 309 1,750 horsepower locomotives for general use on the system, production of which took place from 1960 until 1965. Most were built at the famous Vulcan Works at Newton-le-Willows in Lancashire, alongside the West Coast main line, but some were built in Darlington at the works of Robert Stephenson's and Hawthorne, which famous name company had become part of the English Electric Group in 1955. The design of these Type 3s was based on the very first mainline diesel locomotives produced by the LMS with English Electric mechanical parts as far back as 1947, so they'd been well proved in service. They were intended for mixed traffic duties, as were all the early diesels, and were to be seen all across the country, frequently on the ever-expanding network of Freightliner services, one of the positive aspects of the Beeching plan for the railways, which was having such a drastic effect on the railways of Britain during the mid-1960s. Another effect of the Beeching plan, well known for its pruning of the actual railway track mileage, was an effective speeding up of the dieselisation policy, which had been gathering momentum from the late 1950s. As lines closed, so would the requirement for locomotives be reduced. This meant that diesels intended for older services, which had now disappeared, would be available elsewhere and thus supplant steam locomotives at a faster rate. It also meant that the new standard diesel classes would be seen across the remaining network on the prestige trains and further reinforce the spirit of change. However, many observers thought that the English Electric Type 3s harked back to the first generation diesel outline with their pronounced nose ends, whilst the Brush Type 4s looked to the future with their more modern flush ends. Both would prove to have extremely long service records, lasting in frontline service into the era of privatisation at the end of the century. Brush, having become part of the Hawker-Siddeley Group in 1966, remained an active player in the British Railways market and would be the leading supplier of new locomotives, including reworking the Type 4s, until the end of British Railways' own existence. The new Type 4s would ultimately take over much of the role of the Western region's Western diesel hydraulics, as that bold experiment was declared non-standard by British Rail towards the end of the 1960s, the much reduced network being easily worked by the large numbers of the standard classes, as the effects of the reshaping of British Railways continued on their way. English Electric had a consolation prize in the second generation Type 4 category, when it supplied a series of 50 Type 4 machines during 1967-68 for use on the West Coast main line north of Crewe to Glasgow, as part of the final rundown and elimination of steam on that route. They were supplied under a unique arrangement whereby English Electric retained ownership and leased them to British Rail, an arrangement which lasted for 5 years and was the company's last involvement with British locomotion. The rundown of steam continued across the railways of Great Britain throughout the 1960s. On British Rail, most modern freight was placed in the hands of the new diesels, as they were equipped with the new air brakes to run with the new wagons. Many of the earlier diesels had dual braking so that they could handle both the new and old types of wagons, while steam locomotives were never considered for fitting with modern air braking. Steam and the old freight stock were to be eliminated concurrently. Steam would, however, remain in Great Britain on the many privately preserved lines which were being established in the 1960s, and curiously on the one narrow gauge line still owned by British Rail in North Wales, the Vale of Rheidol. London Transport would keep a few ex-Western region pannier tanks in action until the end of the decade, and many industrial concerns still boasted fleets of small steam shunters. Amongst these was the Ford Motor Company at its Dagenham works in East London, which had also been one of the earliest adopters of diesel traction. These dated back as far as 1932, when 3 American boxcar-style diesel shunters had been set to work. They would be retired even before steam had been eliminated in Great Britain. Ford also became one of the railway's best customers, using dedicated containers on railway wagons to transport car parts from its various works in Europe, as well as using the British Rail car-carrying trains to distribute complete cars and vans. The second British Rail region to eliminate steam was the Scottish region, some 3 months after the closure of the Somerset and Dorset. That left pockets of steam in the North East on the Eastern region and the North West on the London Midland region, both using steam to deal almost entirely with freight traffic. Only on the Southern region, which boasted the last steam main line to Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth, was steam still used on express passenger services. Serving the south coast, and in particular the London suburbs and the Channel ports, the Southern had commenced electrifying its network on the third rail system from before the 1923 grouping. Steam locomotives had been of secondary importance, the early express classes such as the Maunsell Lord Nelsons, seen here, being relegated to services such as the ocean liner expresses from Southampton docks in the 1950s. These magnificent machines, once the most powerful steam locomotives in Great Britain, were to be withdrawn by the end of 1962, together with most of the pre-war Southern steam locomotives. This was in accordance with the Southern's own long-term locomotive strategy, which was to replace steam progressively by electrification. The plan had merely been delayed by nationalisation and British Railways' lack of funding, and had resumed with the Kent Coast schemes of the 1950s. Now it was time to deal with its core route. Southampton was central to the Southern system in many ways, docks having been massively developed by the railway company between the wars, and it was the source and destination for the largest part of its freight traffic. Special shunting locomotives have been part of its charm, notably the post-war American USA shunters. These were replaced from 1962 by a fleet of Ruston and Hornsby diesels, which were unique within the British Railways diesel fleet. Sadly, their working lives were short, as the docks traffic fell away very rapidly at the end of the decade, as containerisation took hold and a new Freightliner depot was built further along the River Tess to handle this traffic. The first fruits of the reignition of the Southern's electrification policy were a bit of an oddity, but still conformed to the Southern strategy. The Isle of Wight Railways had been operated by a fleet of elderly steam locomotives comprised of old London and South Western Railway Class 02 tank engines. Originally built for London suburban and branch line work in the 1880s, many of the class had been rendered redundant in the early 1920s by electrification, so were transferred to the island. There they held sway until the 1960s, when Dr. Beeching proposed closure of all the remaining island lines. Vigorous local opposition to this resulted in retention of a short stretch from Ryde to Shanklin, and the question was how to modernise it at minimum cost. At the time, London Transport was replacing its standard stock, dating from 1923, and they were available at scrap prices. The Southern bought some and refurbished them. Just as the O2s before them had emigrated to the island, so did 6 3-car and 6 4-car former underground units, to create an electrified system of just 8.5 miles in length. Much of the Southern's core main line to Wessex already had electric third rails in place, and Dr. Beeching took care of what to do with the long straggling main line beyond Salisbury to the West Country by passing it over to the Western region. The main line to Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth remained and was still steam worked. In the very financially straitened times of the early 1960s, British Rail either wasn't willing or wasn't able to finance another full-scale electrification scheme, one which wasn't included in the still current modernisation plan. Previous mainline electrification schemes had included new locomotives in stock or new electric multiple units. The Mark I coaches of British Railways were still in production in the early 1960s, and there was no question of replacing them for electrification. Waterloo, to use the common nickname of the Southern management team, came up with an ingenious cut-price electrification scheme which met with the approval of the BR board, as it meant that the Southern would comply with the board's aim to eliminate steam entirely. In essence, the line from Bournemouth to Weymouth would use the surplus diesels, as the economic case for this part of the route was slightly dubious. These were to be fitted with Southern Electric multiple unit connections to enable them to be remotely controlled from a standard Southern multiple unit cab. The latter were to be fitted to a number of the standard Mark I coaches, which would be formed into unpowered sets, which the diesels would propel from Weymouth to Bournemouth. The electrification would commence there, and high-powered electric units, again using some of the Mark I coaches, will then haul the train sets which had come from Weymouth to London, leaving the diesels at Bournemouth to reverse the process for trains from London. It was a remarkably efficient system and a very flexible one. The high-power units used at the London end of the trains on the electrified part of the line boasted 3,300 horsepower and 100 miles an hour maximum speed. The non-powered units looked to all intents and purposes the same as electric units, but were either pulled or pushed by the powered ones or the diesels. With up to 8 unpowered coaches being pushed at speeds up to 100 miles an hour, there were some questions about their safety, as this was to be the first time in the world where such practice was to be undertaken. Previous push-pull trains had been used on local services at low speeds with short trains. Tests were undertaken and the working arrangements were found to be perfectly safe. Born of necessity, the cut-price Bournemouth electrification turned out to be a world beater, as the high-speed push-pull principle would be adopted on railways across the globe, as well as 20 years later on the West Coast Main Line, the hugely expensive flagship scheme of British Rail. Use of the diesels wasn't confined to the Weymouth line. Waterloo was still responsible for local services as far as Salisbury on the West of England Main Line, and there was no prospect of electrification from Basingstoke to Salisbury. The use of the diesels with the unpowered push-pull stock enabled the Southern to integrate these services with the electric ones, they being in effect pseudo-electrics. Proof of the pudding was the famous Sparks effect. Prices of houses in the New Forest and places such as Winchester soared, and the passengers flocked back to the railway. Implementation of the Bournemouth electrification on the 10th of July 1967 meant that the last steam main line would be no more. Towards the end, many special trains would be run using native locomotives, but one visitor was especially welcome. This was Sir Nigel Gresley, the locomotive named in honour of the great engineer and a member of his most famous class, the A4 Pacifics. Marginally more famous was the world steam speed record holder Mallard, but Sir Nigel held his own record, the highest recorded post-war steam speed. The locomotive had been purchased by a group of railway enthusiasts from British Rail in full operating condition, whilst the iconic speedster had been preserved for the nation and would become a museum piece, stuffed and mounted. Sir Nigel Gresley is seen here on shed at the last mainline loco shed in London, 9 Elms. It came to work 2 rail tours on the Southern Main Line on June the 3rd and 4th, 1967, just 5 weeks before the curtain finally came down. This wasn't the first time an A4 had appeared at Waterloo. Mallard had worked out of the Southern terminus in the summer of 1948, during what became known as the Great Locomotive Exchanges. This was a series of test runs by examples of the leading locomotives of the Big Four, organised by the then new British Railways to try to find out what the strengths were of each, with a view to incorporating the best into the proposed range of standard designs. Mallard was tested on the Atlantic Coast Express from Waterloo to Exeter Central, the famous 11 o'clock train which served virtually every branch line terminus on the southern sprawling network of lines in Devon and Cornwall. The Ace had been a victim of Beeching and the Western region, running for the last time at the end of the 1964 summer timetable, its raison d'etre, the branch lines, being closed as soon after that as possible. Sir Nigel Gresley, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the London and North Eastern Railway, had once had an assistant who had left the LNER in 1937 to take up an appointment on the Southern Railway, and whose name would be forever linked to the last hurrah of Southern steam, Oliver Vaughan Snell Bullied. The last fleet of express passenger steam locomotives to work on Britain's railways were the Bullied Pacifics, assisted at the end by various standard classes. It is, however, the Pacifics which are remembered most fondly. The Southern, pursuing its aim of complete electrification of its system before the Second World War, had put steam locomotive building and development on the back burner. Steam was to be used only until the electrics took over. The war derailed the plan, and emergency measures had to be put into effect to renew the steam fleet as the completion of the electrification programme receded. Bullied, something of a maverick, something of a genius, and something of a visionary, grasped the nettle and produced some of the most advanced steam locomotives ever to run on Britain's railways in the form of 140 Pacifics of two varieties. The Bullied Pacifics in their original form owed something to the designs of Gresley, especially the A4s. Like those engines, Bullied's machines had 3 cylinders and much of their workings enclosed by external cladding. This cladding was described as air-smoothed rather than streamlined, and their valve gear ran in an enclosed oil bath. There were other deviations from conventional practice, and it remains a mystery today as to how Bullied persuaded the Southern Board and the government in wartime to finance the construction of such unusual machines. Whatever the merits or otherwise of the Bullied features, it was shown in the locomotive exchanges that they were very expensive to operate, having a voracious appetite for coal. In the somewhat austere world of the nationalised railway, this couldn't be tolerated, and 90 of the unconventional locomotives were rebuilt into the form seen here during the 1950s, producing an extremely elegant and modern but conventional-looking locomotive. Known collectively as rebuilds, there were 2 varieties of Pacifics split into 3 classes. This is a light Pacific, a member of the Battle of Britain class. It had once borne the name 145 Squadron, commemorating one of the fighter squadrons which fought over the southern skies during the Second World War. It was identical to the next Pacific we see, which was, confusingly, a member of the West Country class, and still bore its nameplate showing it to be Wimpole, a station on the West of England main line. Members of the 2 classes were more similar to one another than to other members of the same nominal class, as there were variations in tenders and cabs during construction, the class names being spread unevenly through the various batches. They had proven to be a good investment in the end, and worked the last steam main line just as the Southern management had envisaged in its original pre-war electrification plan. There were 110 locomotives of the light Pacific variety, 60 of which were rebuilt. Through the cab window we get a glimpse of their original air-smoothed form. 14 of these originals or unrebuilts survived on the 1st of January 1967, the start of the final year of Southern steam. Just 2 of these were still running on the last day. In a support role to the Bullied Pacifics at the end were a number of British Railways standard locomotives. These had been designed as go-anywhere, use-anywhere locomotives, which were, in contrast to the complex Bullieds, extremely simple to maintain and repair. 20 of these standard class 5 460s, to give them their clumsy full titles, were allocated to the southern region when built in the 1950s. This is one of 15 slightly smaller standard 460s on the Southern, this time of Class 4. They'd also been built for the Southern and remained there all their lives, having double chimneys fitted at Eastleigh Works to improve their steaming. The other variety of Bully Pacific were the merchants, or packets, the latter referring to the first of the class, which was the first Bully Pacific of all. This was Channel Packet, progenitor of 30 Merchant Navy class Pacifics, which appeared in 1941. All were rebuilt in the 1950s into the form displayed by 35008 Orient Line, one of the initial batch of 10 and the last survivor and third longest lived member of the Bully Pacific type. We see her on the first official BR Farewell to Express Passenger Steam Special at 09:55 on the 2nd of July 1967, leaving Waterloo Station. 2 specials ran that day, although steam wasn't scheduled to finish for another week. Orient Line had had her nameplates refitted for this run, which took her to Weymouth and pleased the participants with speeds up to 88 miles an hour on the way out and 90 on the way back. The warship at the platform end is a reminder of the new order, although it was something of an interloper on the Southern, being provided by the Western region for the rump of the West of England services via Salisbury to Exeter. It's being passed by the second special, headed by the famous Clan Line at 12:20 and going only as far as Bournemouth. Giving a helping hand at the back was 82019, one of the standard Class 3 tank engines to which had fallen the final duties of Waterloo Station pilots and haulers of empty coaching stock trains to the carriage sidings at Clapham Junction. Although steam had nearly another week to go, these 2 trains ran on a Sunday, and the publicity attracted crowds at many of the intermediate stations to witness what was described as the celebration of the last steam main line in Great Britain. Curiously, the first train was routed onto the slow lines out of London, this being Rains Park Station just beyond Wimbledon. Many people were disappointed to find that the Bournemouth Bell, or Pullman train that day, was hauled by a diesel, a small batch of these having been loaned to the Southern region for the last few weeks of the steam service, and thus spoiling the claim that the Bournemouth line services had gone direct from steam to electric without ever being dieselised. It seemed that British Rail, keen to make money out of those willing to pay the exorbitant fares on the 2 specials, were trying to avoid giving them the pleasure of seeing working steam in its final hours. The Southern, at least, had achieved its aim of almost complete electrification, and steam had finally gone. An instantly recognisable logo was the symbol of the new British Rail, devoid of the paraphernalia of the Victorian Steam Railway, which celebrated the end of the swinging 60s and looked forward to the new decade of the 1970s. 15 years earlier, the British Transport Commission had announced its 15-year modernisation plan, so it was now complete, and it was time to review its achievements. The railway of 1970 was very different to that of 1955. For a start, it was a different colour. Everything that moved was blue, sometimes with a dash of white or grey, and modern graphics proclaimed this was an integrated railway, so first impressions pointed to success. The corporate era had arrived, and this was one of its finest expressions. If recognition of a logo is success, British Rail was a success. There were new trains, new stations, new services, new uniforms, and new projects upon which to embark. But the latter were going to need new funding. The £1.5 billion pot which the modernisation plan had been given by government had been spent, much of it on the West Coast Main Line electrification.
The Queen has just opened the most modern railway terminus in Britain. This is not it, but it does illustrate the extraordinary obsolescence of some of our railway architecture. Just along the road from the brand new Euston, St Pancras was opened as the first Midland terminus a century ago. Its Gothic extravagance was an attempt to design a railway station which would utterly overshadow Euston and King's Cross. At last, Euston gets its revenge. Rebuilt over the past 5 years, is now the most modern railway terminus in Europe. Cars and taxis enter at basement level, and escalators bring you up to the vast passenger concourse. To open this £15 million showpiece, the Queen had travelled down from Balmoral. It's a complete transformation of London's oldest mainline station into her newest and most up-to-date. It's also the focal point in the electrification of main routes between London, the West Midlands and the North West. The whole atmosphere is more like an airport than a railway station, a definitely jet-set quality everywhere. Let's hope this up-to-the-minute quality is reflected in the timekeeping of the trains that use it.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it's fascinating to hear the views from the swinging 60s about St Pancras, which would become the symbol of yet another age on the railways, ours, when the modern Euston would be regarded as sacrilege. But the railways of Britain, as they entered the last third of the 20th century, wanted to be rid of the heritage which had bedeviled them for the previous third of a century, as they had fallen from grace and the travelling public had turned to a new god, the road. The middle third had been painful in the extreme, and the extensive surgery recommended by the most famous doctor of the time, the now ennobled Lord Beeching, had left a leaner and arguably fitter railway system, ready to face the future, a future dominated by money and galloping inflation. The early 1970s railway passenger preparing to board the Flying Scotsman at King's Cross Station would find his seat in the air-conditioned comfort of the new Mark IID coaches, which bore the Intercity brand name. This was being promoted alongside the British Rail name and was becoming internationally recognised. It stood for quality and convenience on the principal main lines, especially for the business traveller. The coaches themselves had only recently appeared on this service. At the head would be one of the 100-mile-an-hour Deltic diesels. The Deltics were the most powerful diesel passenger locomotives in use on British Rail metals and looked positively massive in their sparkling rail blue paintwork with bright yellow ends to warn anyone of their imminent arrival. Safety was a priority on the modern railway. The new air-conditioned coaches truly were a revelation in 1970. They were an update of the earlier versions of the Mark II, which meant that they had no separate chassis, the principal constructional difference to the Mark I's. Visually, they were different due to the elimination of window ventilators, which would make them extremely quiet and relaxing in which to ride and work. Intercity was being promoted as the ideal transport for the business traveller, as he could work or even have meetings as he travelled, and business was being clawed back from the airlines. The design of the Mark II coaches had created a lighter and quieter coach, which allowed the designers to add air conditioning without too high a penalty on train weights. Use of the Intercity brand name had proven to be vastly better for promoting an image of excellence than what had gone before, and was the first instance of a break from the all-embracing unified image of the corporate era. It separated the frontline trains from the local and commuter services, and it would eventually become a separate business unit within British Rail, and the spearhead for the privatisation which would come at the end of the 20th century. Although locomotives are the focus of the enthusiast's attention, to the ordinary railway customer the railway carriage is of supreme importance. How this is perceived is central as to how the railway itself is perceived. The original Mark II coach had been designed in 1964 and was already looking a little dated by comparison to its air-conditioned sibling. Budget constraints meant that no catering vehicles had been designed as part of the Mark II fleet, so the use of older Mark I catering stock stood out in the otherwise modern-looking trains. The last part of the 1960s was characterised by financial problems. Even though devaluation hadn't affected the pound in your pocket, it had made it difficult for the government-owned railways to invest in further development after the end of the modernisation plan era. But no business can afford to stand still. In the white heat of the technological revolution, British Railways still needed to move forward. The question was how. British ingenuity and the making the best of what we have attitude was called for. The success of the Bournemouth electrification and its high-speed push-pull system had been done on the cheap, but proved to be a world leader in simplifying operating practices. Could this be done elsewhere? Diesel multiple units had been highly successful on the Glasgow to Edinburgh services, which now needed more accommodation, but there was no funding. As with the Bournemouth project, an ingenious solution was devised to make improvements without a substantial capital outlay. Using standard sets of the new Mark II coaches and the Scottish Region's Type 2 diesel locomotives, a control system was designed to allow these to work in multiple, but with one at each end of the train, effectively creating a multiple unit push-pull train. The new trains started running in May 1971, and the improved environment of coaches without the noisy diesel engines under the floor was much appreciated by passengers. St Pancras Station and the Midland Main Line to Derby, Nottingham and Sheffield were the embodiment of the BR Board's problems. These had seen little investment even under the modernisation plan. As we've already observed, faced with the lack of investment capital, the British Railways Board had had to make the best of what it already had, and the return of a Conservative administration in 1970 boded ill for an industry which had just spent £1.5 billion on modernisation and wanted more. Unfortunately, the Midland Main Line had hardly featured in that plan at all, except for the replacement of steam locomotives by diesels. There was no mention of electrification and no plans to upgrade any part of the route. Under the Beeching plan, it had been cut back between Derby and Manchester, and the direct line to Nottingham had been shut. The Beeching cuts were now all but complete, and the network would remain relatively stable from here on, but the Midland Main Line was now seen as a secondary main line, despite the fact that it still served major cities including Leicester, Derby, Nottingham and Sheffield. The continuity of much railway infrastructure and the requirement to get the maximum return from investments means that investment plans need to keep in mind the so-called cascade of stock from one type of service to another. No orders have been placed for new diesel locomotives since the 50 English electric Type 4s for the West Coast Main Line north of Crewe in 1965. At the beginning of the 1970s, Midland Main Line trains were still in the hands of the first generation Type 4 diesels, known as British Railways Sulzer Type 4s, which had been built in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they were no longer cutting edge in appearance. Indeed, by this time they were starting to look more dated than St Pancras Station itself. There was no prospect of a cascade of locomotives other than the English electric Type 4 CoCos, but only after the completion of the West Coast electrification north of Crewe, although some of the brush Type 4s would appear on the line at times. Mention of 3 different types of locomotives as Type 4 shows how confused and clumsy the identification of the new locomotive types was. British Rail decided that this was a problem and embarked on a renumbering scheme together with a new classification system known as TOPS. This was a computerized system introduced on the Southern Pacific Railroad in the USA, an acronym which stood for Total Operations Processing System. The system was introduced for bookkeeping purposes in 1968, and all locomotives were reclassified with a numerical designation. Initially, these weren't shown on the locomotives themselves, although, following the demise of steam, diesels had the D prefix removed. From 1973, an improved TOPS system was introduced, and the TOPS numbers started to appear on locomotives themselves and all rolling stock. The standard Type 4 from Brush became Class 47, whilst the earlier BR-built heavyweight machines, so familiar on the Midland Main Line, were divided into 3 separate classes, 44, 45 and 46. The English electric Type 4s became Class 40 for the early heavyweight ones and Class 50 for the later ones for use on the northern part of the West Coast Main Line. There was little difference to be seen between the classes 44 to 46, other than in the form of head code box on which the train identification number was shown. Computerization would ultimately make these redundant. These locomotives had their origins, and class nickname of peaks, in the last order of the pilot scheme, which produced 10 2,300 horsepower locomotives built at Derby and bearing the names of mountains in the Peak District of England, which was appropriate as they were the heaviest diesels to run on BR. Their story is a little complicated, but hopefully worth explaining. The pilot scheme ones became Class 44 and were followed by a production order for 183 machines. These would become classes 45 and 46 and differed only in the electrical equipment fitted, 127 Class 45s having Crompton Parkinson ones and 56 Class 46s brush ones. They were built at Crewe and Derby. Their engines were Sulzer 2,500 horsepower ones. An uprated version would be fitted to the Class 47s, themselves an updated version of the 46s, and the first 20 of these actually replaced the last 20 Class 46s. Another part of the railway which was feeling the investment squeeze was the rural network, or what was left of it. The last gasp of the Beeching cuts in the 1960s saw the Minehead and Ilfracombe lines closed, and from 1971 onwards, when only 23 miles closed, the network was virtually stable, as was the train fleet. Rural services, and the commuter lines that hadn't been electrified, were the preserve of the diesel multiple unit fleet. Many of the lines which these had been built for had now gone, so there was some thinning of their ranks. The early pre-modernisation plan units were deemed non-standard and withdrawn. The remaining ones, not being of Intercity stock, received a coat of all-over rail blue livery, which somehow denoted their inferior status. The changeover period resulted in a rather patchwork appearance, which further emphasised the run-down nature of these lines. However, they were paying their way, or were subsidised, and the oil crisis of 1973 made politicians realise that reliance on road transport alone was not a viable option, and that rail might, after all, be part of the future of transport. The immediate effect was that closures would no longer be on the agenda, but there was still no money for investment. It was decided to refurbish the best members of the diesel multiple unit fleet to give them a further 10 to 15 years useful life. The majority of these would be the later Derby units, now classified as Class 108, and the Metropolitan Camel units, now Class 101. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it did at least mean that the services on rural lines would see some improvement and underscored that they were still wanted. But the Western region's diesel hydraulics weren't. If you went to the Western solitary London terminus at Paddington in the early 1970s, you would find a railway which was out of step with the standardisation of the corporate philosophy. The Western had always been different, and had been allowed to experiment with a fleet of diesels which were markedly different to anything else that ran on British rail. The resultant locomotives looked quite superb, but had suffered from reliability problems. The new regime had a surplus of locomotives for its reduced network, so anything deemed non-standard was unlikely to have a long working life. Many of the small fleets of unsuccessful diesels resulting from the poor decisions made in the panic orders phase in the 1950s had already been withdrawn, and the focus was now on the larger non-standard fleets. The hydraulics were as non-standard as they could be. To the passenger, the trains looked to be part of the corporate era, although there weren't any of the nice new Mark II coaches here. That was because the warships, even when doubled up, and the Westerns couldn't pull them. This wasn't due to a lack of power, but because they didn't have compatible heating systems for the Mark II stock, all of which, except the very first batches, had electric train heating and air brakes. The hydraulics had steam heating boilers and vacuum brakes. The very last built warship had nearly got electric train heating equipment before it was completed, and some parts were ordered, but it was released to traffic in the same form as its sisters. The first hydraulics to go were the very first, 5 pilot scheme machines built by North British and completely different to those which followed. They went in December 1967, even before steam had been completely eliminated on British rail. But they were obvious candidates for early withdrawal. What weren't were the first 3 of the Swindon type, D800 to 802. These had been added to the pilot scheme orders and were the basis for all the subsequent Type 4 hydraulics. They went in 1968. In that same year, the West of England expresses were to be speeded up. Rather than use the Westerns, the warships were rostered in pairs. This gave a nominal 4,000 horsepower for the trains, but had no effect on the speed, as both types of hydraulics were only permitted to run up to 90 miles an hour. The reason for the use of two warships was that they weren't really suitable for freight work, whilst the Westerns could be so used. The summers of 1968 to 1971 marked the final fling for the Western region hydraulics en masse. Railway enthusiasts, deprived of steam on the main lines, flocked to the South Devon resorts for their summer holidays, as the unusual hydraulics gave some of them a substitute interest, which was different to the overall corporate conformity seen elsewhere on the British Rail network. The warships took centre stage, and their imminent demise gave them something of a celebrity status. By this time, those loco spotters of the 1950s were adults and were starting to flex their muscles and take an interest in the preservation of parts of their railway heritage. A holiday in South Devon could be combined with volunteering on the Dark Valley Railway, which had been purchased from British Rail and was now about to start its new career as a tourist destination. The new interest in diesels would also lead to a realisation that they too were part of the railway heritage, and two of the warships would be saved from the scrapman when they were finally retired, which took place in 1972. The last built members of the class had only lasted barely 10 years in service, having almost as short a working life as some of the standard steam locomotives. Their demise wouldn't simply affect the Western region. They were the standard power on the former Southern region West of England line from Waterloo, and one is seen passing the site of Nine Elms Loco Shed right at the end of their tenure. The question was, what would replace them? The answer to the question of replacing the warships on the Western lines was quite complex, and in the best tradition of cascading. The first part was, following the completion of the Euston to Birmingham electrification, to close the Western region main line beyond Birmingham, and to reduce the service to that of a semi-fast one. Then replace the Westerns on the remaining Birmingham line services with Class 47s. That meant that the Westerns could all be deployed to the southwest, whilst the problem of the ex-Southern line could be solved by handing it back to the Southern. As soon as the warships had gone, other hydraulic classes, particularly the mixed traffic Type 3 Hymex, were also withdrawn, and the future looked grim. But another question soon reared its ugly head. Would the Westerns be next? The biggest hydraulics, the oldest of which had only had 10 years' service, now came under threat. Enthusiasts could hardly believe these beautiful machines were about to go. Sadly, they had always had some trouble living up to their image. In 1965, for example, only 60% of the class was available for work, so British Rail would be glad to see the back of them. As it would the other refugees from the Birmingham line, the Blue Pullmans. But all that was nothing compared to what was going on the Southern, an icon.
Leaving Victoria Station for the last time, one of the most famous trains in the world. The Brighton Bells carriages haven't been replaced since 1933, when the then Southern Railway electrified the Brighton line. It was a nostalgic affair to see the old lady go, a sad parting for many famous people. Passengers in period costume, bands playing, it was more like a festival than the ending of an era. This is about the last time you'll see people dancing on a station platform. The professor was never one to miss out on a kiss. Now the guard gives the signal to pull away for the last time. Other famous passengers were actress Mara Lister and satirist Alan Melville in one of the blue and grey coaches. Star Brighton resident Dame Flora Robson. Jimmy Edwards, a regular user, reminisces about the Brighton Bell. The train arrived at Brighton to the accompaniment of the Haywards Heath Silver Band. The train started life in 1908 as the Southern Belle, but it's now uneconomic to run. She's being replaced by a more up-to-date service.
Of course, nothing was more up-to-date than the West Coast Main Line. Although the Brighton Belle would simply be replaced by faceless standard Southern Electric units, on the Premier Line, both the name which the London and North Western Railway had adopted for itself and a statement of fact concerning the resources that British Rail had poured into it over the past 10 years, the new trains and locomotives were to be the foundation of a series of cascades which would resolve the question of what was to become of the Western region without Westerns. Without a doubt, the electrification of the West Coast Main Line had been a tremendous achievement, transforming a steam age line, albeit an efficient one, to the most modern main line in the British rail portfolio, could legitimately be so described. But it had been done by wiring the existing lines, rather than rebuilding them altogether. It might be the most modern type of railway in Great Britain, but by the time it was completed it certainly wasn't state-of-the-art. The controversial rebuilding of Euston Station was probably the only way that an old-fashioned steam age structure could be updated, but this approach hadn't been followed through elsewhere. The West Coast Main Line had been built up piecemeal through the Victorian age, when average speeds of 50 miles an hour were considered advanced. The new West Coast Main Line still had a maximum speed limit of 100 miles an hour. Somewhat to the horror of a railway system whose largest terminal station was called Waterloo, the mantle of the most advanced railway system had been usurped by the Japanese and the French. Euston was now British Rail's flagship station. Through its modern portals filed people from about a third of the country. It served Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Chester, Wolverhampton, Warrington, Lancaster, Carlisle, and even Inverness with long-distance services. The facilities were the most up-to-date, and it was starting to live up to the grand claims that had been made for it back in 1955 when the modernisation plan had been announced. In addition to its long-distance services, it had a very busy commuter network, which, although it was on nothing like the scale of the southern one, had been modernised as part of the electrification programme and now served the northern suburbs of London and the towns to the northwest of the city, including Watford and Northampton. Customer reaction was electrifying too. In the first 3 months, the number of people using the route went up by 61%, and soon 1 in 4 air passengers had turned to the train, figures which were vital to the case British Rail was about to put to the government. The West Coast Main Line electrification wasn't complete. Almost as soon as the Queen had declared the new Euston open, British Rail applied to the government for more funding to complete the exercise. Wires were needed to take the electric services over the border and into Scotland. Approval for the extension from Weaver Junction to Glasgow Central, effectively doubling the length of the electrified services, was eventually granted in January 1970, and preparations for the work started immediately. In those straitened economic times, there was no opportunity of taking a leaf out of the Japanese example and building a brand new railway in Great Britain. But our new European partners, the Heath government, signed up for membership of the European Economic Community in 1972, were experimenting with Très Grande Vitesse, or TGV trains. At this time it was translated to very high speed trains, and the French government was to authorise the construction of brand new railways through the French countryside by the middle of the 1970s. Many experimental trains had been built in France, and the world speed record for rail traction had been French since the 1950s. So the question was, would the new part of the West Coast electrification bring a high-speed line to Great Britain? Sadly not. 100 would remain the goal, so the replacement of the Class 50s north of Crewe wouldn't bring any decrease in journey times. The 50s were already paired up like the warships to speed up the Anglo-Scottish trains, and the electrification would simply make the service far more efficient. But the 50s would be released, to go south to the Western region to replace the Westerns. The continuing plan for the railways of Great Britain was driven by electrification. Not all of the Class 50s would be displaced, however, as the London Midland region announced that they would be keeping 15 of them for use on freight trains and overnight trains, as well as for emergency use when the power was switched off for maintenance purposes. There were 50 50s. This meant that there were only 35 available to go to the rescue of the Western region, and none for the Midland Main Line. Another project was going ahead, which would more than make up for this, but for the time being the Westerns would be fitted with the necessary equipment to allow electric train heating and the introduction of the early Mark II stock with vacuum brakes. Cold economic facts dictated the progress of the electrification. Experience from the electrification of the southern part of the West Coast Main Line had shown that lighter overhead equipment could be used, and this was to be employed on the final stretch. Traffic was of far lower density here, so signalling didn't need to be quite so closely spaced. The work could go on without completely shutting the line down. But one effect of the economic downturn would ultimately prove to be a benefit to the railways. The Labour government had cancelled a number of high-profile aeronautical projects, including the TSR fighter. The result was that aeronautical engineers started to look for work elsewhere, and a number migrated to the railways. They were encouraged to examine new approaches to increasing speeds on the existing railways, in particular the West Coast Main Line with its excessive curvature. There was no possibility of new railways, so this was the only way forward for British Rail. Press reports indicated that a new project was being formulated to produce a train which could tilt when passing around curves, and thus by reducing the sideways forces felt by passengers, speeds could be increased substantially. The train was dubbed the Advanced Passenger Train, and it was confidently forecast that the first such trains would be in service on the West Coast Main Line by 1976. There would be a high-speed railway to compete with the French after all. This whole change in attitude was directly attributable to the success of the West Coast electrification. Whereas the post-Beeching British Rail in 1965 had issued a policy document which stated that it expected mainline passenger traffic to ebb away, the new line mirrored the Sparks effect that was so familiar to the southern region. The early promise was continued, so that passenger numbers had soon doubled from pre-electrification days, and the Birmingham service, inaugurated with an hourly frequency, was also doubled to a half-hourly one. Both government and British Rail management did a volte-face. High speed was what it was all about. As electrification work progressed along the northern part of the West Coast Main Line through the scenic Lune Gorge, drivers on the new M6 motorway could observe a form of transport where there was a substantially higher speed allowed than the 70 miles an hour on restricted roads. The promise of higher speeds than 100 was, as the wiring commenced, just that, a promise. Current technology only allowed electric locomotives to pick up power from the overhead wires at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. Above that, it was thought that aerodynamic forces would cause the pantograph's contact with the bare copper wire to fluctuate, leading to problems both of pickup and of maintenance. This would be a bar to increasing speed, so a project was initiated to develop a new form of pantograph which would overcome these problems. Naturally, this would have a direct bearing on the production of the new advanced passenger trains. Apparently the French had overcome this problem, but their record-breaking electric locomotives, which had broken the world speed record in 1955 with a maximum of just over 150 miles an hour, they would naturally make it sound more impressive, 243 kilometers an hour, were being run under test conditions. BR needed day-to-day reliability. Whilst the final wires were going up on the southern part of the west coast, the French did it again, increasing the record to 235 miles an hour in December 1967. But this time with a train powered by aero engines, a one-off experimental train. The British ex-aeronautical boffins were confident they could do as well, and whilst they were still awaiting a decision on the extension of the wiring to Glasgow, British Rail so dazzled the government officials with promises of a high-speed future that the Treasury agreed to the necessary funding. The engineers worked at the British Rail Technical Centre in Derby, established in 1963 to investigate the relationship between the rail and wheel profiles that were causing problems with hunting at high speed. This they did and successfully overcame the problems, amongst other things helping cure the problems associated with the warships and westerns. Their work on this is featured in a newsreel.
Derby, centre of British Rail research. Here in this £4 million technical centre, British Rail concentrates all its design, research and development work. A new extension has just been opened by the Minister of Transport, and we had a look at some of the work going on. This is a test rig to study hunting, the swaying that affects rolling stock at certain speeds. At Derby, they design out this hunting effect to ensure smooth running. In this case, they're working on a rail wagon for high-speed liner trains. What about the future? This is a model of British Rail's transport of tomorrow, a passenger train that will lean on the curves as it belts along at up to 150 miles an hour. It may be in service in 5 years' time. Powered by aircraft engines, it'll do London to Newcastle in 2.5 hours.
Perhaps the last remark was significant. The East Coast, like the Great Western and Midland main lines, had no electrification plan. The APT engineers were starting with a clean sheet. They had formulated a number of ideas, but the central theme was to use or create tilt technology. The trains would be made from lightweight composite materials and would use aircraft-type multi-disc braking to enable them to stop within conventional signalling distances. The impression of a rail-bound aircraft was further emphasised by the power unit, an aircraft gas turbine engine, a 1500 horsepower Rolls-Royce Dart. This was proposed for the prototype, which would make it suitable for all lines, so would help fill the gaps in the East Coast, Western and Midland mainline locomotive replacement plans. The train would have a maximum speed of 155 miles an hour and be able to take curves 4% faster than conventional trains. Revolutionary steering suspension would lead it into the curves and reduce wear and tear. Squadron service, how appropriate, could be achieved by 1972. Although the government now believed that this world beater would prove to be a world exports beater as well, it took them a couple of years to produce the money. Orders were placed for the prototype APT hardware in 1969. The engineers had changed their minds whilst this was going on, and the Rolls-Royce Dart engine was now going to be a pair of Leyland turbines developed for road trucks, and the brakes would be hydrokinetic ones. Construction started, and the prototype was wheeled out to start trials on the Derby team's test track, as recorded by the newsreels.
Beginning a series of slow-speed runs at Derby, British Rail's advanced passenger train is intended for speeds of more than 150 miles an hour. The team of research engineers who designed the train are there to check on the behaviour of their latest creation. The new suspension and tilting system is made specially to cope with the much higher speeds of the future. Drivers and stokers of the old steam days would certainly scratch their heads if they were told to work with this modern control panel. That's the lever which controls the powerful gas turbine engines. Top speed for this first trial was only 40 miles an hour, but speeds will be increased with each test run till they reach 155 miles an hour when the experiments are completed. British Rail have plans already for a high-speed train to take over an Intercity route towards the end of the year.
That prediction was hopelessly optimistic. The APT prototype first ran on the 25th of July 1971. It was so revolutionary that the testing programme was prolonged and secret. The main problem was the Leyland turbine. It failed to live up to expectations and proved very heavy on fuel. So when the oil crisis hit in 1973, the BR priorities changed. Approval was given to build 8 pre-production prototypes, but they would each have 2 power cars in the centre of the train, powered from the overhead wire. The APT had become a West Coast electric train. The order was placed for just 4 trains, shortly reduced to 3. That effectively killed any opportunity of running a scheduled service rather than just a test programme. The rest of the story is history, but the APT never took off. Meanwhile, back in the real railway world, the West Coast extension was getting close to completion. A batch of 35 new locomotives was ordered, and construction was being undertaken at Crewe. They were the exact opposite of the APT, a simple update of the Class 86s, which had proven so successful on the southern part of the electric system. They were the first locomotives to bear a TOPS number and classification from new as Class 87. Sometimes they were referred to as AL7s, but this was never official. The locomotives were built between 1973 and 1974, and all were ready for the introduction of the full service that year. Their distinguishing features were clean cab ends with just 2 windscreens and no headbox. Display of head codes was abolished at the beginning of 1976 for the remainder of the locomotive fleet. Although an update of the 86s, the 87s were a lot more powerful, with 5,000 horsepower against the earlier machine's 3,600. 3 of the latter were fitted with 5,000 horsepower engines as testbeds for the 87s, but it was mainly to try out new electrical equipment rather than the traction motors. An additional Class 87 was ordered to act as a testbed in its turn for an improved power control system known as thyristor control, which would become the future standard. Number 87001 was completed in June 1973 and was tested on the main lines later that month. It proved to be a useful improvement on the Class 86, and the two types together are regarded as the second generation of AC locomotive types. They were equipped with multiple working controls to enable them to work in pairs or with those of the Class 86 fleet, which had the same gear. Their electrical equipment came from GEC, the company which had merged with the well-known English electric company whose Vulcan works at Newton-le-Willows was right alongside the newly electrified main line. They were designed for 110 miles an hour operation, although the line speed was initially held at 100 miles an hour pending the design of new pantographs, which would later be retrofitted to the class to allow them to work at their design speed. The 87s became the flagships of the BR fleet. Although they never wore the attractive electric blue colours of the earlier machines, they looked quite splendid in the corporate blue when brand new. Their clean, simple lines drew much praise. They were used on the Anglo-Scottish services from the opening day in May and were referred to as the Electric Scots in the accompanying publicity. With the completion of the West Coast electrification project, the modernisation plan's principal aims had been achieved. The launch of the new services received much favourable publicity, and British Rail could be said to have come of age. From the depths of despair in the world wars through the trying times of the early nationalisation days, the painful elimination of steam, and the bloodletting of the Beeching years, a new railway had risen phoenix-like from the ashes of the old. And it was the old railway guard who pulled it out of the mess that the ill-starred venture into high technology threatened to plunge it again with the APT. There was a strong faction in British Railways who questioned all that and sought to progress along conventional lines. Taking their examples from the successful locomotive at each end of a set of conventional coaches, pioneered on the Glasgow to Edinburgh route, and designing a new range of Mark III coaches to go with them, they produced a new train suitable for all non-electrified routes with a design top speed of 125 miles an hour. The coaches were a development of the Mark II air-conditioned ones, this time including catering vehicles, and the locomotives were dedicated single-ended high-power machines to form an Intercity express train for the future. The prototype of their research surfaced at the same time as the APT prototype. It was the first high-speed train, or HST.
I include Mr. Richard Marsh, Chairman of British Rail, Mr. Keith Speed, MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Department of the Environment, members of Parliament from both sides of the House, trades union officials, and gentlemen of the press. Although today it's restricted to a speed of 100 miles an hour and only short spurts at 125, the new train's capable of speeds up to 150 miles an hour. The automatic doors are operated by a treadle under the carpet. The buffet car will serve breakfast, light-cooked meals, cold snacks, and of course drinks. The kitchen cars will even be fitted with microwave ovens for ultra-rapid service. But before final specifications are settled, British Rail will invite you, the passengers, to say what you think of the seating, lighting, air conditioning and general comfort.
And their answer was, we love it. The HST was everything the APT wasn't, and squadron service as the legendary Intercity 125 commenced on the Great Western Main Line in 1976.
In this 20th century of speed, British Rail has produced the Intercity 125, a new generation of high-speed trains capable of 125 miles an hour. Veteran driver Fred Moss takes her out on the inaugural run to Cardiff. The down train meets the up train. Simultaneously, another 125 leaves London for Bristol. With that 125 miles an hour goes plane comfort, and it's a smooth ride, even at top acceleration. The 125 isn't intended to be a Concorde on rails, but its time-cutting is an important part of the service. 23 minutes off the 145 miles between London and Cardiff, 1/5 better than the old-timers of a week ago. To a businessman, it's time that could mean money. The usual home comforts can cut the time finer still. Travel is comfortably serene, described by the first passengers as a smooth glide without vibrations. The 125 carries 2 drivers, and both are enthusiastic about the train's performance. The panel is streamlined and easy to check quickly. So far, service is limited, but British Rail has its eye on other long-range routes. London to the Scottish terminals, for instance, a long, tiring journey by car that businessmen may prefer to cover in comfort by high-speed rail. Journey's End, a journey that was comfortable, clean and fast. And not a second wasted. The shape of things to come, these speedy trains provide the world's fastest regular diesel service. Not only Britain...
For once, it wasn't hyperbole, and a newly confident British Rail was proud to celebrate the 125th anniversary of one of its greatest stations. What a contrast to the views expressed just 10 years earlier. And it could even let steam return.
From the time when rustling crinolines swept the broad platforms until the present day, Paddington has given non-stop service. The magnificent roof arches, influenced by the design of the Crystal Palace, have remained virtually unchanged. It's a tribute to engineer Brunel that his overall design of the station has fitted so well into today's requirements. Handling many thousands of commuters daily, Paddington is still the major rail outlet to the west. To mark the occasion, one of the most famous steam locomotives of the 20s, King George V, comes out of retirement. This wonderful old giant was the first of 30 to be built in 1927 to haul the heavy Great Western expresses. Today, in carriages of the 1950s, it will carry enthusiasts on a nostalgia run to Didcot. A gift from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the American Type Bell. It's 14 years since Paddington has seen a steam locomotive in action. For most of its life, of course, Paddington has known only the massive dignity of steam. But 1965 saw the end to all that. Although diesel is now king, the old King George V has his day. The locomotive's vital statistics make impressive reading. Weight, 135 tons, 14 hundredweight. Driving wheels, 6 feet, 6 inches. Tractive effort, 40,300 pounds. A sight few modern youngsters have ever had. No doubt hissing disapproval, the King George V passes its modern counterpart. Travelling at 60 miles an hour, it soon reaches Didcot.
King George V was truly an historic locomotive. When steam was eliminated by British Rail in 1968, no one expected it ever to return to the main lines. But Great Western Locomotive number 6000 returned just 3 years later and opened up a whole new chapter in the history of railways. The public loved it, and now they love the railways again. And looking back, perhaps they never really did fall out of love with them. Throughout the hard times, there was always someone to boost them, support them, get them some sort of finance when it was needed, protect them, protest in favour of them, try to save them. And always the railway workers with their jobs on the line pulled them through, so that, however many times they fell, they would rise again, and they allowed British Rail to declare in 1981, "This is the age of the train."